Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Daniel Keene, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2024. The late autumn chill crept through my fleece jacket as I stared at the weathered trail map. The crackling of the campfire behind me was the only sound breaking the profound silence of Shawnee National Forest. 3 days into our week-long hiking trip, and already something felt wrong. "You're overthinking it," Marcus said, poking at the flames with a stick. "We've hiked worse trails than this." I nodded absently, tracing our planned route through Garden of the Gods and toward Bellsmith Springs. The truth was, something had been nagging at me since we'd passed that abandoned cabin yesterday. Those strange symbols carved into the doorframe, the way the woods had suddenly gone quiet. "Come on," Marcus continued, his voice carrying that familiar impatience. "We've been planning this trip for months. Don't get all weird on me now." Marcus Hudson had been my best friend since college. At 35, he was the adventurous one, always pushing for one more mile, one more challenge. I was usually the voice of reason, but this time the roles felt reversed. He seemed oblivious to the wrongness I felt in these woods. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my head snapping toward a rustling in the underbrush. Marcus sighed. "Probably just a raccoon. You've been jumpy since we passed that local who warned us about staying on the trails." I remembered the old man at the last outpost before we entered the deeper part of the forest. His weathered face had crinkled with concern when we mentioned our route. "Folks don't go to that part of Bellsmith after dark," he'd said in a hushed tone. "Not since the Harlow incident back in '98. When we'd pressed him for details, he'd simply shaken his head and muttered something about the skinwalker of Shawnee before shuffling away. The memory sent a shiver down my spine. I returned to my tent, zipping myself into the sleeping bag despite the fact that it wasn't fully dark yet. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of being watched from between the trees. The morning dawned gray and misty. As I crawled out of my tent, I noticed Marcus already breaking down his gear. "We should make Bellsmith by nightfall if we get moving," he said, not looking up. "Weather report says rain tomorrow." I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. We were deep in one of Illinois' few genuinely remote areas. I packed quickly, trying to shake the uneasiness that had followed me through the night. Our hike took us deeper into the forest, away from the more trafficked tourist areas. The sandstone formations of Garden of the Gods gave way to deeper woods and narrower trails. By midday, we were traversing ridges that offered spectacular views of the autumn colors sweeping across the forest below. "This is why we come out here," Marcus said, breathing deeply at a vista point. For a moment, my anxiety ebbed. The forest was beautiful, aglow with the burnished reds and golds of fall. But as we descended into a narrow valley, following a creek that would eventually lead us to Bellsmith Springs, the shadows lengthened prematurely. The dense canopy overhead allowed only occasional splinters of light to reach the forest floor. "Trails getting hard to follow," I noted as we picked our way across a series of fallen logs. "GPS says we're still on track," Marcus replied, though when I glanced at his hand, I saw him tapping the screen with frustration. "Damn thing keeps glitching." We pushed forward, the creek our only reliable guide. The water moved strangely, sometimes seeming to flow upstream for brief stretches before resuming its normal course. I didn't point this out to Marcus. He'd only accuse me of seeing things. As the afternoon wore on, the forest grew increasingly dense. What had begun as a well-marked trail had deteriorated into little more than a game path. The creek beside us had widened into a series of stagnant pools, black and still in the dimming light. "We should have reached Bellsmith by now," Marcus finally admitted, frustration evident in his voice. I pulled out my own map, comparing it to the terrain around us. Nothing matched. According to the map, we should be approaching a series of natural springs and rock formations. Instead, we were in a densely wooded depression with no landmarks visible through the trees. "I think we need to make camp," I suggested, eyeing the darkening sky. "Try again in the morning." Marcus started to argue but was interrupted by a sound that froze us both in place. A long, keening wail echoed through the trees. Not quite human, not quite animal. It lingered in the air before fading, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered. I shook my head, feeling the hair on my arms stand on end. "Mountain lion, maybe?" But we both knew mountain lions didn't sound like that. "Let's set up camp," Marcus agreed. His earlier bravado vanished. "There's a clearing up ahead." The small clearing offered just enough space for our 2 tents. We worked quickly, speaking little as we assembled camp. Neither of us suggested building a fire, though the temperature was dropping rapidly. There was an unspoken agreement that drawing attention to ourselves might be unwise. As we finished securing the rainfly on my tent, Marcus suddenly went still, his gaze fixed on something behind me. "Dan," he said quietly, "don't turn around yet, but I think someone's watching us." A cold sweat broke out across my back. "Where?" "Between those 2 big oaks about 50 yards back. I just caught a glimpse." I busied myself with the tent stakes, then casually straightened and stretched, using the motion to turn slowly toward the direction Marcus had indicated. At first, I saw nothing but deepening shadows between the ancient trees. Then a subtle movement caught my eye. Something was there, partially hidden behind one of the massive trunks. A figure, too tall and too thin to be a normal person. In the failing light, I couldn't make out details, but I had the distinct impression it was watching us intently. "Do you see it?" Marcus whispered. I gave a slight nod, my mouth too dry to speak. "What do we do?" I forced myself to look away, pretending I hadn't seen anything. "Act normal, get in the tents. Maybe it's just another hiker." But we both knew better. No hiker would stand motionless in the growing dark, watching strangers from a distance. We finished our tasks in tense silence, moving with deliberate normalcy while keeping track of the figure from the corners of our eyes. It hadn't moved closer, but it hadn't left either. "I'm going to try the radio again," Marcus said, his voice pitched just a bit too loud, as if he wanted whatever was watching to hear that we had some connection to the outside world. Inside my tent, I tried to calm my racing heart. The logical part of my brain insisted there must be an explanation. Another camper, perhaps, or even a park ranger checking on backcountry hikers. But deeper instincts screamed that whatever stood in those trees was not human. The 2-way radio crackled with static as Marcus attempted to reach anyone on the emergency channels. Between bursts of white noise, I thought I heard something else. A whispering voice, too faint to make out words. "Anything?" I called to Marcus. "Nothing clear," he replied. "Just static." We settled in for what promised to be a long night. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually overcame fear. I drifted off to troubled dreams filled with tall, thin figures moving between trees and strange symbols carved into ancient bark. I woke suddenly, gripped by the certainty that something was wrong. The inside of my tent was pitch black. My watch read 3:17 a.m. Then I realized what had woken me. Absolute silence. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling. Even the ever-present sound of the creek had stopped. "Marcus?" I whispered. No response. Slowly, fighting against every instinct telling me to stay hidden in my sleeping bag, I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, much brighter than it should have been under the forest canopy. Marcus's tent stood intact, its shadow sharp against the silvery ground. Nothing moved in the unnatural stillness. Then I saw the footprints. Not human tracks, but long, narrow depressions in the soft earth, leading from the tree line directly to Marcus's tent. They weren't there when we'd gone to sleep. "Marcus," I hissed, louder this time. No response. Fear congealed in my stomach as I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam seemed feeble against the bright moonlight as I directed it toward my friend's tent. The entrance flap hung partially open. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to zip up my tent and pretend I'd seen nothing. Instead, I forced myself to crawl out, the cool air raising goosebumps on my skin. The strange tracks continued past Marcus's tent and back toward the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. I approached his tent cautiously, calling his name again. When no answer came, I steeled myself and pulled the flap aside. The sleeping bag was empty. "Marcus," I called, my voice breaking the eerie silence. The inside of his tent was in disarray, sleeping bag unzipped and contents of his backpack scattered. His boots still sat neatly by the entrance. He'd left barefoot. The realization hit me like a physical blow. No experienced hiker would wander into the forest at night without boots. Something was very wrong. I grabbed my pack, shoving in essentials while trying to think clearly through the panic. The tracks led away from camp. If I followed them, I might find Marcus. But the idea of walking into those dark woods, following whatever had taken my friend. A low, rhythmic sound broke the silence. A soft humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It raised the hair on the back of my neck, a melody that felt ancient and wrong. I had to find Marcus. Flashlight in one trembling hand, hunting knife in the other, I followed the strange tracks into the forest. The moonlight created deceptive shadows between the trees, shapes that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. The tracks remained clear, pressed deep into the soft forest floor. Occasionally, I found other signs, a broken branch, disturbed leaves, as if something heavy had been dragged. "Marcus," I called, no longer caring if I attracted attention. Nothing but the faint humming answered, growing subtly louder as I moved deeper into the trees. I lost track of time as I followed the trail. The forest around me began to change in subtle ways. The trees grew more gnarled, twisted into unnatural shapes. The ground became increasingly spongy beneath my feet, tiny holes pockmarking the soil, countless little voids that seemed to breathe in unison, triggering a visceral revulsion in me that I couldn't explain. The tracks led to a sudden depression in the landscape, a hollow where the trees formed an almost perfect circle around a small clearing. In the center stood a crude structure made of branches and animal bones, resembling a primitive shrine or altar. The humming was loud now, pulsing in time with the subtle movement of the earth beneath my feet. Those tiny holes expanded and contracted, as if the ground itself were breathing. And there was Marcus, standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, his back to me. "Marcus," I whispered, relief washing over me. "Thank God, we need to get out of here." He didn't respond or turn. As I approached, I noticed he was standing unnaturally straight, his bare feet sunk several inches into the soft ground. "Marcus." I reached for his shoulder. When he turned, the moonlight illuminated a face that was no longer entirely his own. His features had subtly shifted, eyes too wide and skin stretched too tight across his cheekbones. His mouth hung slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "The forest wants us to stay, Daniel," he said, his voice overlaid with another sound, like multiple voices speaking in unison. "It's been so long since it fed." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Marcus, this isn't you. We need to go. Now." His head tilted at an impossible angle. "I've seen what lies beneath, Daniel. The hunger that never ends. The Hollow One has shown me." "Who? What are you talking about?" I clutched my knife tighter, though I knew I could never use it against my friend. Marcus smiled, revealing more of those two sharp teeth. "The Skinwalker of Shawnee. The one who wears the flesh of those who wander too deep. It's wearing me now, Daniel, and it's so hungry." From the center of the clearing, something began to rise from the bone structure. A tall, emaciated figure, limbs too long and joints bending in impossible directions. Its skin was a patchwork of different textures, as if pieces had been collected from various sources and stitched together. Where its face should have been, there was only a blank expanse of taut skin. "Run!" Marcus suddenly gasped, his voice momentarily his own again, eyes clearing for just an instant. "It can't follow beyond the springs. Run!" Then his face contorted back into that terrible smile and he lunged at me with inhuman speed. I reacted on instinct, sidestepping his attack and running blindly into the trees, away from the clearing, away from whatever was pretending to be my friend. Behind me, I heard pursuit, the crash of branches and a high, keening wail that raised primal fear in my chest. I ran without direction, flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the forest floor, illuminating those disturbing breathing holes that now seemed to be everywhere. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. The sound of rushing water ahead gave me hope. The creek, or maybe the springs Marcus had mentioned. I broke through a line of dense underbrush and found myself on the edge of a steep ravine. Below, moonlight gleamed off the surface of flowing water. The wailing behind me grew closer. I had no choice. I half climbed, half slid down the ravine wall, loose rocks and soil cascading around me. I hit the bottom hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. The springs spread before me, a series of clear pools connected by small waterfalls. The water glowed with an unusual blue phosphorescence, casting an ethereal light across the rock formations. I splashed into the nearest pool, gasping at the shocking cold. Behind me, at the top of the ravine, a silhouette appeared, the impossibly tall, thin figure from the clearing. It paused at the edge, that blank face seeming to stare directly at me. Marcus's words echoed in my mind. "It can't follow beyond the springs." The creature paced along the ravine edge, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then, with a frustrated wail, it retreated into the forest. In its place appeared Marcus, or the thing wearing his skin. He looked down at me, his face twisted with hunger and rage. "You can't stay in the water forever, Daniel," that chorus of voices called down. "And when you come out, we'll be waiting. The forest has chosen you." I waded deeper into the springs, moving from pool to pool, putting distance between myself and the ravine edge. The ethereal blue glow of the water provided just enough light to navigate by. My mind raced, trying to form a plan beyond simple survival. As I moved through the series of interconnected pools, I noticed markings on the surrounding rock faces. Ancient petroglyphs depicting elongated human figures and strange symbols similar to those I'd seen on the abandoned cabin. Some showed scenes of figures in water, protected from the tall, thin beings that lurked above. The springs had been a sanctuary before. Perhaps they still were. I found a small cave behind one of the larger waterfalls, just big enough to provide shelter. There, shivering and exhausted, I took stock of what I had. Flashlight, knife, a small first aid kit, energy bars, and half a bottle of water. Not enough to last long, but perhaps enough to survive until daylight. Throughout the night, I heard them calling, sometimes with Marcus's voice, sometimes with that inhuman wailing. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement along the ravine edge, prowling back and forth. The thing that had been Marcus knew I was here. It was waiting. Morning brought no sun through the dense canopy, just a gradual lightening from pitch black to gray gloom. The calls had stopped sometime before dawn, but I didn't trust the silence. Moving cautiously, I emerged from my hiding place. The springs looked different in daylight. Less mystical, but no less strange. The water still held a subtle glow, and the rock formations around the pools formed unnatural angles that seemed to trick the eye. I needed to find my way out of the forest, back to civilization. But which direction? The ravine had disoriented me, and without my phone or GPS, I had no sure way to navigate. A sound caught my attention. Not the wailing from before, but a soft splashing from further down the springs. I froze, knife ready, as a figure emerged from behind a rock formation. It was an old woman, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, face deeply lined with age and sun exposure. She wore practical hiking clothes and carried a well-worn walking stick. Most surprisingly, she didn't seem alarmed to find someone else in this remote location. "You're one of the lucky ones," she said without preamble, her voice gravelly with age. "Most don't make it to the springs." I stared at her, knife still raised defensively. "Who are you? How do you know about this place?" "Name's Eleanor Blackwood. I've been tracking the Hollow One for 40 years, ever since it took my brother in these very woods." She approached slowly, keeping her hands visible. "You can put that down. If I were one of them, I couldn't cross the water, now could I?" Reluctantly, I lowered the knife. "My friend, it has my friend." Eleanor's face softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, son. Once the skinwalker takes someone, there's no getting them back. Not really." "What is it?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since that terrible moment in the clearing. She settled herself on a flat rock, leaning heavily on her walking stick. The local Shawnee had stories about it, a spirit that could wear human skin. Early settlers called it a witch. These days, folks who've seen it and lived call it the skinwalker of Shawnee. But what does it want? "Hunger," she replied simply. "It feeds on fear, on suffering. It takes people, wears them for a while, uses them to lure others. When the skin wears out, it takes another." I thought of Marcus's distorted face, the way his voice had been overlaid with others. There were multiple voices when it spoke through Marcus. Eleanor nodded grimly. "It keeps them, in a way. Every person it takes becomes part of it, their consciousness trapped while the Hollow One wears their flesh." The horror of this sank in slowly. Marcus wasn't just dead, he was imprisoned within that thing. "How do we kill it?" I asked, a cold determination replacing my fear. Eleanor gave me a long, appraising look. "I've been trying for decades. The springs weaken it. The water holds old medicine, old protection. But to destroy it?" She shook her head. "I don't know if it can be killed, not completely." "Then how do we escape? It said it would wait for me." "It can't leave its territory, these few square miles of forest. If we can reach Jackson Falls to the south, we'll be beyond its reach." She pointed downstream. "The springs flow that direction. Follow the water, stay in it when you can, and we might make it." I didn't fully trust this strange old woman who had appeared so conveniently, but I had a few options. "Why help me? You don't know me." Eleanor's weathered face hardened. "Like I said, that thing has my brother, and my nephew after him. I've seen too many folks go missing in these woods. Besides," she added, standing with a grunt of effort, "I'm getting too old for this fight. Maybe it's time to pass the torch." Together, we began making our way downstream, following the springs as they merged into a fast-flowing creek. Eleanor moved with surprising agility for her age, navigating the slippery rocks with practiced ease. As we traveled, she told me more about the creature and its history. The Hollow One had been in these woods for centuries, occasionally dormant for decades before beginning a new cycle of feeding. The abandoned cabin I'd seen with the strange symbols had belonged to a local healer who'd attempted to contain the entity in the 1930s. The Harlow incident the old man at the outpost had mentioned referred to a family of 4 who'd disappeared in 1998, presumed to have gotten lost and died of exposure. "The Forest Service closed that area for months," Eleanor explained. "Found the mother's body eventually, but not the rest. I know what happened to them." By midday, we'd made good progress, the creek widening as we moved south. I began to hope we might actually escape. Then, as we rounded a bend in the watercourse, Eleanor suddenly grabbed my arm, pulling me down behind a fallen log. "Don't move," she whispered. On the opposite bank stood Marcus, or what had once been Marcus. In daylight, the wrongness of him was even more apparent. His skin hung loosely in some places, stretched too tight in others. His movements as he scanned the creek were stiff, mechanical. "It's following the water," Eleanor whispered. "It can't cross, but it can track alongside." "I thought you said it couldn't leave its territory." "We must still be within its hunting grounds. Jackson Falls is another mile downstream." We remained hidden, hardly daring to breathe, as the thing wearing Marcus paced along the bank. Eventually, it moved back into the forest, but we waited another tense 10 minutes before continuing, now moving with painstaking caution. The creek led us to a series of small waterfalls cascading over rock shelves. We were forced to leave the water briefly to navigate around them. Each time we stepped on dry land, I felt exposed, vulnerable, expecting at any moment to hear that terrible wailing or see Marcus's distorted form emerge from between the trees. As we approached what Eleanor assured me was the boundary of the creature's territory, the forest around us began to change. The trees grew more densely packed, branches intertwining overhead to block most of the daylight. The breathing holes I'd noticed in the soil appeared again, more numerous than before. "Something's wrong," Eleanor murmured, her eyes darting between the trees. "It's changing the forest, reshaping its territory." A distant wailing started, not from one direction but seemingly from all around us. The soil beneath our feet began to shift and bubble, those breathing holes expanding. "Run!" Eleanor shouted. "Get to the falls!" We abandoned stealth for speed, splashing through the shallow creek where possible, scrambling over rocks and fallen trees. The wailing grew louder, and the forest itself seemed to be closing in around us, branches reaching like grasping hands. Eleanor was falling behind, her age finally showing as she struggled to maintain pace. "Keep going," she urged when I slowed. "I'll catch up." I hesitated only briefly before pushing forward. The sound of rushing water grew louder. Jackson Falls had to be close. Breaking through a final stand of twisted trees, I found myself at the top of a spectacular waterfall. The creek plunged nearly 80 feet down a series of rock ledges into a wide pool below. Beyond that, I could see normal, healthy forest. No breathing ground, no gnarled trees. The boundary. Safety. I turned back for Eleanor just as she emerged from the trees, limping badly now. Behind her, the forest floor was rippling like the surface of a pond, and from those undulations rose several tall, thin figures. Skinwalkers, their blank faces turning toward us, their movements jerky but frighteningly fast. "Go!" Eleanor shouted, stumbling toward me. "Get across!" I lunged forward, grabbing her arm to help her toward the falls. We were only 20 feet from the edge when the ground beneath her feet suddenly collapsed. Eleanor cried out as she sank to her knees in the breathing earth. I seized her hands, trying to pull her free, but it was like quicksand, sucking her deeper with each movement. The skinwalkers were approaching rapidly, no longer trying to hide their unnatural forms. "Let go," Eleanor said with sudden calm. From her pocket, she pulled a small leather pouch. "Take this. It will protect you if you ever need to return." "I'm not leaving you." I pulled harder, but she was waist deep now, the earth swallowing her. "You have to. Tell people what happened here. Don't let them forget again." She pressed the pouch into my hand. "Now go." The nearest skinwalker was only yards away, its blank face stretching and tearing as a mouth formed, a jagged hole filled with needle-like teeth. Behind it came the thing wearing Marcus, its borrowed face split in a hungry grin. With a final desperate look at Eleanor, I turned and ran for the falls. There was no path down, only the water's route. Without hesitation, I leapt into the cascading torrent. The shock of the impact drove the breath from my lungs. The current seized me immediately, tumbling me over the rocks. I fought to keep my head above water as I was swept downward, each impact against the stone ledges sending pain shooting through my body. Finally, I plunged into the deep pool at the bottom. Disoriented and half-drowned, I flailed toward what I hoped was the surface. My lungs were burning when I finally broke through, gasping and coughing. I dragged myself to the rocky shore, every muscle screaming in protest. When I looked back up to the top of the falls, I saw them. a line of tall, thin figures staring down. Among them stood Eleanor, her posture now stiff and wrong, her face blank and smooth where features should be. They watched me in silence for a long moment. Then, as one, they turned and disappeared back into their twisted forest. It took me 6 hours of hiking to reach a ranger station. My story was met with skepticism, then concern for my mental state. The search for Marcus found nothing. No clearing with a bone altar, no cave behind a waterfall. The map I'd been using matched perfectly with the terrain they found, but they also found no sign of Marcus. I've returned to my normal life now, but I know the truth. The Hollow One is still out there in Shawnee Forest, wearing my friend's skin, wearing Eleanor's, wearing all the others it has taken over the years. I keep Eleanor's leather pouch with me always. Inside are strange herbs, small bones, and a piece of paper with symbols matching those from the abandoned cabin. Protection, she'd called it. Sometimes I dream of returning, of finding a way to free Marcus and all the others trapped within that thing. But for now, I've done as Eleanor asked. I'm telling the story, making sure people know about the Skinwalker of Shawnee. So if you're planning a hiking trip through southern Illinois, stay on the marked trails. Don't venture into the remote areas around Bell Smith Springs, and if you hear a strange wailing in the woods or see someone standing too still between the trees, run. Run for the nearest water and don't look back, because the Hollow One is hungry and the forest has chosen you. My name is Thomas Garrett, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The thing about trauma is that it hollows you out. It scoops away parts of you until you're nothing but a shell walking around with everyone else, pretending you're whole. That's what losing Sarah did to me. When my friends suggested a hiking trip to Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois, I agreed only because saying no required more energy than I could muster. The trip was Jamie's idea. She thought the wilderness might reset me. Matt and Eliza came along too, probably to make sure I didn't wander off a cliff edge accidentally on purpose. "You need this, Tom," Jamie had insisted, her voice softening the way it always did when she talked about Sarah. It's been almost a year. 11 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, to be exact. But who's counting? The drive from Chicago took about 6 hours, most of which I spent staring out the window watching the landscape flatten and then gradually rise again as we approached the southernmost part of Illinois. I barely registered the conversation around me. The occasional question directed my way met with monosyllabic answers. We arrived at Garden of the Gods in late afternoon. The October sun cast long shadows across the ancient sandstone formations, turning them into hulking silhouettes against the dimming sky. Despite myself, I felt a flicker of something. Not quite awe, but an awareness that the world still contained beauty, even if I couldn't fully appreciate it. "This place is incredible," Eliza breathed, her camera already out. She'd always had an eye for natural beauty, one of the reasons she and Matt had connected initially. I watched as her husband wrapped an arm around her waist, kissing her temple gently. The instinctive pang of jealousy that shot through me made me turn away. Jamie caught my eye, giving me one of her "you're doing great" smiles that I'd grown to both appreciate and resent. She was a psychologist by trade, and sometimes I felt more like her patient than her friend. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark," Matt suggested, hefting his overstuffed backpack. "We've got that isolated spot near Rimrock Trail, right?" Jamie nodded, consulting her phone. "Signal's already spotty, but I downloaded the maps. It's about a mile hike from here." By the time we reached our campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks and hickories, the sun had almost disappeared. We worked quickly to set up our tents. I'd be sharing with no one, the extra space a constant reminder of Sarah's absence. "Fire first, then food," Matt declared, already gathering kindling. I helped mechanically, gathering wood while Eliza and Jamie set up the cooking gear. The physical labor felt good, mindless and necessary. Once the fire was crackling, casting flickering light across our small circle, we settled in with our freeze-dried meals. Jamie passed around a flask of whiskey, and I accepted it gratefully, the burn down my throat providing momentary distraction. "So," Jamie said after a while, "I heard some pretty interesting stories about this area when I was researching." Matt groaned. "Please tell me you didn't bring us to haunted woods." Jamie's smile widened. "Not haunted exactly, but there's a local legend about something called the Walker of Shawnee. Supposedly, it's some kind of ancient spirit that takes the form of whoever it encounters." "A doppelganger?" Eliza asked, leaning forward. "Sort of," Jamie replied. "But the stories say it doesn't just copy your appearance. It steals pieces of your memory too, learns enough about you to pass as you." To what end? I found myself asking, the first full sentence I'd contributed all evening. Jamie's eyes met mine across the fire. "To replace you." Matt chuckled nervously. "Well, that's comforting. Thanks for that, Jamie." "Just setting the mood," she replied with a wink. "Besides, it's just a story the locals tell tourists." We fell silent for a while, the crackling of the fire and the distant hooting of an owl the only sounds. The darkness beyond our little circle seemed to press closer, but I found it oddly comforting. The night didn't expect anything from me. It didn't ask how I was doing or look at me with pity. Eventually, we turned in for the night. Inside my tent, I lay awake staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. The sleeping bag next to me remained zipped and flat. I reached out, touching the empty space beside me before pulling my hand back quickly, as if burned. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke with a start, disoriented. The inside of my tent was pitch black, but something had disturbed me. A sound. I held my breath, listening. There, a soft crunching of leaves outside my tent. Footsteps, circling slowly. "Matt," I whispered. "Jamie." No response, just more soft footfalls. I fumbled for my phone, tapping the screen to illuminate the tent. The battery indicator showed 12%. Lower than it should be considering I'd barely used it and had charged it fully before we left the car. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could see a shadow through the thin material, a human silhouette standing perfectly still. "Hello," I called, my voice embarrassingly shaky. The shadow remained motionless for several heartbeats, then slowly, deliberately, moved away and disappeared into the darkness. I lay frozen, heart hammering against my ribs. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, I unzipped my tent and peered outside. The campfire had died to embers, casting just enough light to see that nothing was there. Matt and Eliza's tent was zipped tight. So was Jamie's. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. The witching hour, Sarah would have said. She had been fascinated by folklore and superstition. When the veil between worlds is thinnest, she'd tell me with that gleam in her eye that made it impossible to tell if she was serious or teasing. Sleep seemed impossible now, so I pulled on my jacket and boots and sat outside by the remnants of the fire, feeding it small twigs until it gave off just enough light to hold the darkness at bay. The woods around me creaked and whispered, and occasionally I heard rustling in the underbrush. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Dawn came gradually, the black of night surrendering to deep blue, then pale gray, and finally the gold of early morning sun filtering through the canopy. I must have nodded off because I was startled awake by Jamie's voice. "Early riser or couldn't sleep?" she asked, emerging from her tent with her hair in a messy bun. I blinked up at her. "Had a visitor last night." Her brow furrowed. "What kind of visitor?" Before I could answer, Matt crawled out of his tent, followed by Eliza. "Morning, campers," he yawned, stretching his arms overhead. "Who's ready for some hiking?" I watched them carefully, looking for any sign that one of them had been wandering around in the middle of the night, but they all seemed genuinely groggy from sleep. "Tom says we had a visitor last night," Jamie said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Matt looked around the campsite. Animal? Person-shaped, I replied, standing outside my tent at around 3 in the morning. Eliza's eyes widened. That's creepy. Are you sure it wasn't one of us going to pee? I shook my head. I called out. Whoever it was didn't answer. Probably just someone from another campsite who got turned around in the dark, Matt suggested, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. This area has multiple campsites, right? Jamie nodded slowly. But the nearest one should be at least half a mile away. An uncomfortable silence fell over our group. Well, Jamie finally said, clapping her hands together with forced cheerfulness. Let's get some breakfast and hit the trails. We've got a gorgeous day ahead. The morning progressed with a tense normalcy. We ate, packed day packs for our hike, and secured the campsite. I noticed everyone checking their phones, all with diminished battery life despite minimal use. We chalked it up to poor signal making the phones work harder to find reception. Our plan was to hike the Rim Rock Trail to Pounds Hollow Lake and back, about 7 miles round trip. The trail was stunning, winding through ancient rock formations and forests blazing with fall colors. Under different circumstances, I might have found it rejuvenating. About 2 miles in, we stopped at an overlook. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills carpeted in red and gold foliage stretching to the horizon. Jamie insisted on a group photo, setting her phone on a rock with the timer. "Tom, you need to actually smile," she chided as we gathered for the picture. I made an effort, pulling my lips back in what probably looked more like a grimace. The phone clicked. Jamie retrieved it, frowning at the screen. "That's weird." "What?" Matt asked, peering over her shoulder. She turned the phone around to show us. In the photo, we stood as expected against the backdrop of autumn trees, except my face was completely blurred, as if I'd moved at the exact moment the picture was taken. "You sabotaging my photography skills." "Tom!" Jamie tried to joke, but there was an edge to her voice. "Let me see," I said, taking the phone from her. Sure enough, while everyone else was perfectly clear, my face was a smeared blob. I didn't move. "Maybe it's just a glitch," Eliza suggested, but she was eyeing me strangely. "Take another one," I said. Jamie reconfigured the timer, and we posed again. This time I made sure to remain perfectly still, even holding my breath as the phone clicked. The result was the same. Everyone crystal clear except for my distorted features. "Okay, that's—" Matt trailed off. "Creepy," Eliza finished for him. I handed the phone back to Jamie, a sense of unease crawling up my spine. "Let's keep moving." We continued in silence for a while, the earlier camaraderie evaporating. I could feel them looking at me when they thought I wouldn't notice, exchanging glances with each other. It reminded me of the weeks after Sarah's death, when friends would watch me like I was a bomb that might detonate at any moment. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the trail became less defined. The trees grew thicker, blocking much of the sunlight, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Jamie consulted her downloaded map frequently, her brow furrowing more each time. "Everything okay?" I asked after she'd checked it 3 times in 10 minutes. "Fine," she said too quickly, "just making sure we're on track." But an hour later, it was clear we weren't. The trail should have opened up to Pounds Hollow Lake, but instead we found ourselves in an increasingly dense section of forest with no water in sight. "We must have missed a turn," Matt said, taking out his own phone only to find it dead. "Anyone else have power?" Eliza's phone was at 2%, mine was completely drained. Only Jamie's had any significant charge left, and even that was down to 23%. "This doesn't make sense," Jamie muttered, staring at her map application. "According to this, we should be standing in the middle of the lake right now." A nervous laugh escaped Eliza. "Well, we're definitely not." "Let's backtrack," Matt suggested. "We must have gotten turned around somehow." We started retracing our steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees nearly identical in every direction. "I don't remember passing that rock formation," Eliza said, pointing to a cluster of boulders that seemed to form a crude circle. "Because we didn't," Jamie confirmed, her voice tight. "None of this looks familiar." The realization that we were lost settled over us like a physical weight. I watched as Matt tried to maintain his composure, taking charge as he often did in difficult situations. "The sun's still high enough to navigate by," he said confidently. "The parking lot and campground are south of here. If we keep the sun on our right and walk straight, we should hit a trail or road eventually." It seemed like a solid plan, so we set off in what we believed was a southerly direction. The forest grew quieter the farther we walked, the normal sounds of birds and small animals fading until all we could hear was our own breathing and footsteps. "Does anyone else think it's too quiet?" Eliza whispered after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. She was right. The natural symphony of the forest had been replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Probably just the time of day," Matt said without conviction. "Animals rest during certain hours." Jamie said nothing, her eyes scanning the trees around us with increasing anxiety. I noticed she'd fallen into step beside me, slightly apart from Matt and Eliza, who walked ahead. "You're thinking about that story you told," I said quietly. "The walker." She gave me a sharp look. "Of course not. That was just campfire talk." "But you're scared." She hesitated. "Something doesn't feel right, and those photos." She trailed off, then shook her head firmly. "No, we're just lost, and being lost is making us paranoid." I wasn't so sure. Since Sarah died, I'd developed a hyper-awareness of liminal spaces, those thresholds between one state and another. The forest we were in now felt liminal, as if we were walking through some in-between place that wasn't quite anchored to the world we knew. We walked for another hour without finding any trail or sign of civilization. The sun had begun its descent, the shadows lengthening around us. Matt stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "What is it?" Eliza asked. He pointed silently to a cluster of rocks ahead, the same circular formation we'd seen earlier. "That's not possible," Jamie breathed. "We've been walking in a straight line." Matt shook his head. "We must have curved back somehow." "For an hour." Eliza's voice rose in pitch. "How could we not notice walking in a circle for an hour?" No one had an answer. I approached the rock formation, examining it closely. It consisted of 7 large stones arranged in a rough circle with one larger stone in the center. The center stone had what looked like crude carvings on its surface, lines and swirls that might have been letters in some ancient alphabet. "I don't like this," Jamie said, staying back. "We should go a different direction." I reached out to touch the center stone. The surface was ice cold despite the relative warmth of the day. "Tom, don't," Jamie started, but it was too late. My fingers made contact with the etched surface. Nothing happened. No mystical energy, no strange sensation. Just cold, rough stone beneath my fingertips. I turned back to the others with a shrug. "It's just rocks." But as I moved to rejoin them, I noticed they were all staring at me with identical expressions of shock. "What?" I asked. "Your eyes," Eliza whispered. "What about them?" Matt swallowed visibly. They changed color for a second. I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "That's ridiculous." "I saw it too," Jamie said quietly. "Just for a moment, they weren't your eyes." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "You're all seeing things because you're scared. We need to focus on getting out of here before dark." They exchanged glances but didn't argue. This time, Matt suggested we climb to higher ground to get a better view of our surroundings. We found a steep hill and began the arduous climb up its side, grabbing onto tree roots and rocks for support. The exertion was welcome. It gave us something to focus on besides our growing unease. By the time we reached the top, the sun was noticeably lower, perhaps only an hour or so from setting. The hilltop offered a view of the forest canopy stretching in all directions. In the far distance, I could make out what might have been the glint of water. Pounds, Hollow Lake. Perhaps. "There," I pointed. "If that's the lake, We can use it to reorient ourselves." As I spoke, a strange sensation washed over me, a momentary disconnection, as if I were floating slightly above my own body. It passed quickly, but left me feeling oddly hollow. "Tom?" Jamie was looking at me with concern. "Are you okay? You went pale." "I'm fine," I said automatically. The words felt wrong in my mouth, as if I were speaking lines from a script. A flicker of something, doubt, fear, crossed Jamie's face before she masked it. We should head toward the lake before we lose the light. The descent from the hill was treacherous, loose rocks sliding under our feet. About halfway down, Eliza lost her footing and slid several feet before Matt caught her arm. She gasped in pain as he pulled her up. "My ankle," she grimaced. "I twisted it." Matt helped her to a flat spot and gently examined her rapidly swelling ankle. "Can you put weight on it?" Eliza tried to stand and immediately sank back down, her face white with pain. "Not really." "I'll help you," Matt said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Lean on me." Our progress slowed considerably after that. Eliza hopped awkwardly with Matt's support, occasionally letting out small sounds of pain when her injured foot bumped against the uneven ground. Jamie and I walked ahead, scanning for the easiest path. The sun dipped below the tree line, throwing the forest into premature darkness. Shadows lengthened and merged, creating disorienting patterns. I found myself jumping at movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. "We're not going to make it to the lake before dark," Jamie finally admitted, her voice tight with stress. "We need to find a place to spend the night." "Spend the night?" Eliza repeated incredulously. "Here? With no supplies?" "We don't have much choice," Matt said gently. "You can't keep walking in the dark with that ankle, and we're still miles from anywhere familiar." We found a small clearing surrounded by dense underbrush that offered some protection from the wind that had picked up as night fell. Matt and I gathered what dry wood we could find while Jamie helped Eliza sit comfortably against a fallen log. Starting a fire proved challenging without proper tools, but Matt eventually managed to get a small flame going using his prescription glasses to focus the last rays of sunlight. We huddled around the meager fire as darkness swallowed the forest. "Anyone have food?" Eliza asked, her attempt at lightness undermined by the tremor in her voice. Jamie produced a crushed granola bar from her pocket and broke it into 4 pieces. The tiny morsels did nothing to satisfy our hunger, but the ritual of sharing created a momentary sense of normalcy. "So," Matt said after we'd eaten, "what's the plan for tomorrow?" "Head for the lake," I suggested. "From there, we should be able to find our way back to a trail." Jamie nodded, but her attention seemed elsewhere, her eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond our little circle of firelight. "Did you hear that?" she asked suddenly. We all fell silent, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the soft crackling of our fire. Then, faintly but distinctly, a voice. "Hello," Matt called out. "Is someone there?" The voice came again, slightly clearer this time, but still too distant to make out words. It seemed to be coming from the direction we'd been headed earlier. "Could be another hiker," Eliza suggested hopefully, "or a ranger." "Hello," Jamie shouted, cupping her hands around her mouth. "We need help!" The voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. "Maybe they didn't hear us," Matt said, but didn't sound convinced. "I'll go look," I found myself saying. The words seemed to come from somewhere outside me. Jamie grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? You can't go wandering around the forest at night." "It's not that dark," I argued. Though it was. The only light came from our small fire and the faint glow of the moon through the canopy. "If there's someone nearby who can help, we need to find them." "We stick together," Matt said firmly. "No one goes anywhere alone." But even as he spoke, I felt that strange, disconnected sensation again, stronger this time. I looked down at Jamie's hand on my arm and felt nothing. No warmth, no pressure, just an awareness that something was touching my body. "Tom?" Jamie was peering at my face. "What's going on with you?" I opened my mouth to respond when the voice came again, much closer now and chillingly familiar. "Help me!" My blood turned to ice. It was Sarah's voice. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." "What?" Matt asked. "Tom, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer him. The voice came again, plaintive and desperate. "Thomas, please, help me." Jamie was shaking my arm now. "Tom, what do you hear? Talk to us." But I was already pulling away from her, rising to my feet. Sarah was here. Somehow, impossibly, she was here, and she needed me. "Stay here," I managed to say. "I'll be right back." "Tom, no!" Jamie lunged for me, but I was already moving, slipping into the darkness beyond the firelight. Behind me, I heard Matt's confused questions, Jamie's frantic explanation, but their voices faded quickly as I followed the sound of Sarah calling my name. The forest should have been impenetrable in the darkness, but somehow I could see well enough to avoid trees and navigate the uneven ground. Sarah's voice guided me, growing clearer with each step. "Thomas, I'm here. I've been waiting for you." I stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the one I'd left but illuminated by moonlight that seemed to shine directly down through a gap in the canopy. In the center stood a figure with its back to me. Sarah's chestnut hair, Sarah's slender shoulders, the same green jacket she'd been wearing the day she died. Sarah. My voice broke on her name. The figure turned slowly. Sarah's face exactly as I remembered it, the small scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood fall, the constellation of freckles across her nose, the dimple in her left cheek. But her eyes were wrong, completely black without iris or white. "Hello, Thomas," she said with Sarah's voice. "I've missed you." I took a step back. "You're not her." "Not," Sarah smiled, the expression a perfect imitation of my wife's warm grin except for those terrible eyes. "Of course I am. Who else would I be?" "Sarah is dead," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "She died in a car accident last year." "Not." Sarah tilted her head in a painfully familiar gesture. "Is that what they told you?" "They lied, Thomas. I've been here waiting." A small, treacherous part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to run to her, hold her, take her home and resume the life that had been stolen from us. But the rational part of my brain screamed warnings. "What are you?" I asked. She took a step toward me, moonlight casting strange shadows across her too-perfect face. "I'm whatever you want me to be, Thomas. I can be Sarah forever. We can be together again." She held out her hand. "Don't you want that?" God help me, I did. Even knowing this creature wasn't my wife, the temptation to pretend was overwhelming. "Your friends don't understand you," Not Sarah continued, her voice hypnotic. "They think you should move on, let go, as if what we had could ever be replaced." Another step closer. "But I understand. I know what you've lost. I can give it back to you." Her outstretched hand was inches from mine now. Behind me, I heard distant voices calling my name. Jamie, Matt, even Eliza must have managed to hobble after me. "What would I have to give you in return?" I asked, already knowing the answer somehow. Not Sarah's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Just a little piece of yourself. Hardly anything you'll miss. Your essence, your identity." Those black eyes seemed to expand, filling my vision. "Your place in the world." My friends' voices were closer now, urgent and frightened. "Not," Sarah glanced over my shoulder, her expression hardening. "They're coming to take me away from you again, Thomas. We don't have much time." "You were never here," I said, finding strength in the truth. "Sarah is gone. Whatever you are, you're not her." "Not." Sarah's face twisted with sudden rage, the beautiful features contorting into something inhuman. "You would reject me? After I came all this way for you?" She lunged forward, hands outstretched toward my face. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard. "Not." Sarah loomed over me, her form shifting, stretching. the moonlight revealing glimpses of something ancient and terrible beneath the shell of my dead wife. "Tom!" Jamie burst into the clearing, flashlight in hand. The beam caught not Sarah directly in the face, and she shrieked, a sound no human throat could produce. Matt was right behind Jamie, brandishing a burning branch from our fire. "Get away from him," he shouted, swinging the makeshift torch. Not. Sarah backed away from the light, her form rippling like heat waves off hot asphalt. "This isn't over, Thomas," she hissed in a voice that was no longer Sarah's but something multi-toned and eldritch. "You were meant for me." She retreated into the shadows at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, her silhouette remained visible, a tall, spindly shape nothing like Sarah's, before it dissolved into the darkness. Jamie was at my side instantly, helping me to my feet. "Are you hurt? What was that thing?" I shook my head, unable to form words. The encounter had left me drained, as if something vital had been siphoned out of me. Matt kept his burning branch held high, scanning the trees. "We need to get back to the fire, now." Eliza waited at the edge of the clearing, leaning heavily against a tree. Her face was pale with pain and fear. Was that what I think it was?" she asked as we approached. "The walker," Jamie whispered. "It wasn't just a story." We made our way back to our campfire as quickly as Eliza's injury allowed, jumping at every shadow and sound. The fire had nearly died, but Matt quickly fed it with the branches we'd gathered earlier. Once we were settled back in our small circle of light, Jamie turned to me. "What did it say to you, Tom? What did it want?" I stared into the flames, trying to organize my thoughts. It looked like Sarah, sounded like her. It said, my voice caught. It said it could give her back to me if I gave it a piece of myself. "Your essence," Jamie murmured, "just like in the stories. It wanted to replace you." "But why, Tom?" Eliza asked, her injured foot propped up on Matt's rolled-up jacket. "Why not any of us?" Jamie's eyes met mine across the fire, and I knew she understood before she spoke. "Because he's already halfway gone. Grief has hollowed him out, made him susceptible." The words should have angered me, but they didn't. They were simply true. Since Sarah died, I'd been walking through life as a partial person, never fully present. "The photos," Matt said suddenly. "Your face was blurred because it was already starting to take you." A sick feeling settled in my stomach as pieces clicked into place. The figure outside my tent. The momentary dissociation I'd felt on the hilltop. The way I'd been able to see in the dark forest. "It's inside me," I whispered, true horror washing over me. "It's been inside me since we got here." "No," Jamie said firmly, gripping my hand. "Not completely. If it had truly taken you, you wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. You'd be gone, and it would be wearing your face." "But it's close," I said. It wasn't a question. Jamie didn't deny it. None of them did. We sat in silence for a long moment, the implications hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Matt spoke. "We need to get out of these woods at first light. Find our way back to civilization. And if we can't..." Eliza voiced what we were all thinking. No one had an answer. We took a turns keeping watch that night, though I doubted any of us actually slept during our off hours. I certainly didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face with those bottomless black eyes. When my turn to watch came, I sat staring into the dying embers of our fire, hyper-aware of every sound in the darkness surrounding us. My friends breathing, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. And underneath it all, barely perceptible, a voice calling my name. Not Sarah's voice anymore. Something older, patient, and hungry. Dawn came with excruciating slowness. As the first gray light filtered through the trees, we roused ourselves and took stock of our situation. We were exhausted, hungry, and in Eliza's case, injured. But we were alive, and daylight brought with it a renewed determination to escape. The lake, I said, pointing in the direction where I'd seen the glint of water. "It's our best landmark. Once we reach it, we can follow the shoreline until we find a trail or road." No one argued. Matt helped Eliza to her feet and we set off, moving slowly but steadily through the forest. The morning was eerily quiet. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering, nothing but the sound of our own movement through the underbrush. We'd been walking for perhaps an hour when Jamie, who was leading, stopped abruptly. "Look," she said, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could make out a structure, man-made walls and a roof, a cabin of some sort. "Civilization," Matt breathed. "Thank God." We approached cautiously. The cabin was old but well-maintained, with a small porch and shuttered windows. No vehicle was visible, no sign of recent habitation. "Hello?" Jamie called as we neared. "Is anyone home?" No response. She tried again, louder. Still nothing. "Maybe it's just a hunting cabin," Eliza suggested. "Seasonal use only." "Maybe," Matt agreed. "But even an empty cabin might have a radio, maps, or supplies we could use." He helped Eliza up the porch steps while Jamie and I circled the structure, looking for signs of life. The cabin appeared to be a single-room affair with a door at the front and another at the back. Both were locked. "We could break in," Matt suggested when we regrouped on the porch. "Under the circumstances, I think it's justified." Jamie hesitated, then nodded. "I agree. But let's check for a hidden key first." We searched the obvious places, under the welcome mat, above the doorframe, under flower pots, but found nothing. Finally, Matt used a rock to break the window next to the front door, reached in carefully to avoid the broken glass, and unlocked it from inside. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A wood stove in one corner, a small kitchen area, a table with 4 chairs, and a pair of bunk beds against the far wall. A battery-powered lantern sat on the table. When Matt switched it on, it cast a warm yellow glow around the room. "No electricity," he noted. "But there's a pump sink. Might have well water." Jamie was already examining a shelf filled with canned goods and dried foods. "Provisions," she said with obvious relief. "And look, a first aid kit." Eliza sank gratefully onto a chair, extending her injured leg. "I don't think I've ever been so happy to see 4 walls and a roof." I should have shared their relief, but something felt wrong. The cabin was too perfect, too conveniently placed, and something about it seemed familiar, though I knew I'd never been here before. While Jamie tended to Eliza's ankle and Matt checked the back door's security, I wandered around the small space examining the sparse decorations. A calendar hung on one wall, open to October, but the year was wrong. According to the calendar, we were in 1978. On another wall hung a single framed photograph. I stepped closer to examine it, then felt my blood turn to ice. It was a picture of Sarah. Not just Sarah. Sarah and me, standing in front of a lake I didn't recognize, smiling at the camera. "That's not possible," I whispered. "What's not possible?" Jamie appeared at my side, following my gaze to the photograph. Her brow furrowed. "Tom? What are you looking at?" I turned to her, confusion mounting. "The picture. It's Sarah and me." Jamie's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Tom, there's no picture there. The wall is empty." I looked back. The photograph was exactly where it had been, Sarah's smile as radiant as ever. "You can't see it?" Jamie grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "There is no picture, Tom. Nothing." A cold revelation washed over me. "It's here," I said, my voice barely audible. "It followed us." Jamie pulled me away from the empty wall, her eyes scanning my face. "Listen to me, Tom. Whatever you're seeing isn't real. It's trying to get inside your head." By now, Matt had noticed our exchange. "What's happening?" "He's seeing things," Jamie said. "Things that aren't there." "Not things," I corrected, unable to tear my gaze from the photograph that only I could see. "Sarah," I'm seeing Sarah." Eliza made a small, frightened sound. "The walker?" Jamie nodded grimly. "It's getting stronger. We need to get Tom out of here." Matt crossed to the window, peering out. "It's still at least 5 or 6 hours until sunset. If we leave now, we might be able to reach the lake before dark." "I don't think we should split up," Eliza said, her voice small. "What if it comes back while you're gone?" A valid concern. If the walker could make me see things that weren't there, what else could it do? "We stick together," Jamie decided. "Tom stays where we can see him at all times." She turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "No offense." "None taken." I understood their caution. A part of me, a growing part, didn't trust myself either. We spent the next hour replenishing our strength with canned beans and bottled water from the cabin's supplies. Jamie fashioned a walking stick for Eliza from a broom handle, while Matt packed a small bag with additional provisions. I felt strangely detached from their preparations, as if viewing everything through a fogged window. The photograph on the wall continued to draw my attention, but I forced myself not to look at it, focusing instead on the practical task of refilling water bottles at the pump sink. "Ready?" Matt asked when we'd packed what we could carry. Jamie nodded, but her eyes were on me. "Tom, are you with us?" An odd question with a complicated answer. Was I? Part of me felt a strong urge to stay in the cabin, to stare at that photograph until what? Until the memories it represented consumed me? Until the walker took whatever remained of my true self? "I'm with you," I managed, though the words felt thick in my mouth. We left the cabin and set off in the direction of the lake, Matt supporting Eliza while Jamie stayed close by my side. The day had warmed considerably, but I felt cold to my core, as if some vital heat had been drained from my body. "Talk to me," Jamie said after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. "Tell me what you're thinking." What was I thinking? Images and sensations swirled in my mind. Sarah's face, both as I remembered her and as the walker had shown her. The strange disconnection I'd felt. The cabin that seemed so familiar. "I think it's been watching me for a long time," I said finally. "Since before we came here." Jamie frowned. "What do you mean?" "The night Sarah died," I explained, the words coming slowly as I pieced together a theory I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. I wasn't there. I was supposed to be, but I got held up at work. Jamie nodded. She knew this part of the story, how I'd been scheduled to drive Sarah home from her therapy appointment but had called last minute to say I couldn't make it. How she decided to take a rideshare instead, which had crashed on the interstate. "I think the walker was there that night," I continued. "I think it saw an opportunity, a man about to be shattered by grief, hollowed out and vulnerable. So it's been, what, stalking you for a year?" I shrugged, the movement feeling mechanical. "Maybe, or maybe it just marked me somehow, tagged me as future prey." Jamie was silent for a moment, processing this. Ahead of us, Matt and Eliza moved slowly but steadily, occasionally glancing back to check on us. "If that's true," Jamie said carefully, "then coming here, to Shawnee, might not have been a coincidence." A chill ran through me. "You mean it lured us here? Or influenced one of us to suggest it?" Her eyes met mine. "The camping trip was my idea, Tom. What if it was using me to get you here, to its territory?" The thought was disturbing, but it made a terrible kind of sense. "You said the walker steals memories from its victims. What if it's been taking pieces of me all along? Small pieces, so gradually I wouldn't notice. And now it's accelerating the process," Jamie finished, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine fear. "Tom, if that's true, we need to get you as far from this forest as possible." We quickened our pace as much as Eliza's injury would allow. The trees began to thin, suggesting we were approaching the lake shore. The open space ahead was a welcome sight after the oppressive density of the forest. But as we neared the tree line, That strange, disconnected feeling washed over me again, stronger than before. My vision blurred, then cleared to reveal a familiar scene, the rock formation we'd encountered before, the circle of stones with the carved center rock. "No," I gasped, stopping in my tracks. "Not again!" Jamie grabbed my arm. "What is it? What do you see?" I pointed ahead. The rocks, the circle. We're back where we started. Matt and Eliza had stopped too, looking at me with confusion. "Tom," Matt said slowly, "those are just normal rocks. There's no circle." I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. For a moment, the circle of stones wavered like a heat mirage, then solidified again. "You really don't see it." The three of them exchanged worried glances. "We see rocks," Eliza confirmed, "but not a circle, just random boulders." I took a step forward, drawn to the formation despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. As I approached, I noticed something new, small objects placed on each of the outer stones. Photographs, I realized as I got closer. And on the center stone, something else. A framed wedding picture. My wedding picture. Sarah in her simple white dress, me in my gray suit, both of us radiantly happy. "Sarah," I whispered. "Tom, don't." Jamie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." But it looked real. It felt real. I reached for the wedding photo, my fingers trembling. "Tom," Matt this time, his voice urgent. "Step back from there, now." I couldn't. The photograph drew me like a magnet. My hand closed around the frame, cold metal, solid, and undeniably physical. I lifted it to examine more closely. The image shifted. No longer our wedding day, but Sarah's funeral. Her casket, covered in lilies. Me standing beside it, my face a mask of grief. I dropped the frame with a cry of shock. It hit the center stone and shattered, glass shards scattering across the rock surface. The moment the glass broke, a howling wind swept through the clearing, whipping leaves and debris into a swirling vortex around the stone circle. Through the maelstrom, I heard my friends shouting, but their voices were drowned out by another sound. A deep, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Give yourself to me, Thomas Garrett, your essence for my hunger, your place in the world for my existence." The wind intensified, and with it came a pressure in my head, as if something were trying to force its way into my mind. I fell to my knees, clutching my temples, a scream building in my throat. Through watering eyes, I saw Jamie fighting against the wind to reach me. Behind her, Matt was shielding Eliza with his body, yelling something I couldn't hear. The pressure in my head became unbearable. Memories flashed before my eyes. My childhood, college years, meeting Sarah, our wedding, her death, each one tinged with an oily darkness that seemed to be consuming them from the edges inward. I understood with sudden clarity what was happening. The walker was taking my memories, my experiences, everything that made me who I was. And in doing so, it was becoming me. "No," I shouted, the word tearing from my throat. "You can't have them. You can't have me." The chanting grew louder, more insistent. The darkness crept further into my memories, tainting them, claiming them. Jamie had almost reached me, her hand outstretched. I tried to reach back, but my body refused to obey. I was being locked out of my own physical form. In desperation, I focused on one memory. Sarah, not as the walker had shown her, but as she truly was. Not her death or the grief that followed, but her life. The sound of her laugh. The way she'd dance while making dinner. How she'd squeeze my hand 3 times to say, "I love you," without words. The darkness recoiled from this memory, as if burned by its purity. I seized on this reaction, dragging up more memories. Not just of Sarah, but of everything that anchored me to my humanity. My mother's voice reading bedtime stories. My father teaching me to ride a bike. Jamie's unwavering friendship through the darkest days after Sarah's death, Matt and Eliza's gentle persistence in keeping me connected to the world. Each memory I reclaimed seemed to weaken the walker's hold. The pressure in my head began to subside, the darkness retreating. "It feeds on emptiness," I gasped as Jamie finally reached me, her hands gripping my shoulders. "On the void, grief creates, but it can't take what's still full." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Your connections, your humanity." "Help me remember," I pleaded. "Help me stay whole." Jamie nodded, then turned to call to Matt and Eliza. They struggled against the still howling wind to join us, forming a tight circle around me. "Remember, Milan," Jamie said, her voice strong despite the chaos surrounding us. "Your 31st birthday. We ate so much gelato we could barely walk back to the hotel." "The camping trip in Wisconsin," Matt added, "when that raccoon stole all our marshmallows and you tracked it through the woods for an hour." "Your best man speech at our wedding," Eliza said, her eyes bright with tears and determination. "You made everyone cry, then laugh, then cry again." Each memory they offered strengthened me, filling the hollow spaces the walker had tried to claim. The wind began to die down, the pressure in my head fading to a dull ache. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The forest fell silent, the air still. The stone circle, if it had ever truly been there, was gone, replaced by ordinary forest rocks scattered randomly across the ground. I looked at my friends, their faces tense with concern and lingering fear. "It's gone," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. I think it couldn't take enough of me." "Because we wouldn't let it," Jamie said fiercely, helping me to my feet. "Because you're still here, Tom. Still whole. Exhausted but alive." We continued toward the lake, which now genuinely appeared through the thinning trees. As we emerged from the forest onto the shore, we saw something that brought tears of relief to all our eyes. A park ranger station at the far end of the lake, its flag visible in the late afternoon sun. The ranger, a middle-aged woman named Catherine Mills, was initially skeptical of our story about getting lost, but the state of Eliza's ankle and our obvious exhaustion convinced her we needed help. She radioed for medical assistance and loaded us into her truck for the drive back to the ranger station. "You folks are lucky," she commented as we drove. "People get turned around in these woods all the time. Not everyone finds their way out." I caught Jamie's eye at this statement, but neither of us elaborated. What would we say? That an ancient spirit had tried to steal my identity? That it had nearly succeeded? At the ranger station, a medic examined Eliza's ankle. A bad sprain, not broken, and checked the rest of us for dehydration and exposure. We were given food, water, and the use of phones to call for a ride, as our car was still parked at the Garden of the Gods trailhead. While Jamie made arrangements, I stepped outside onto the station's porch, breathing in the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. Beautiful, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. "You okay?" Matt asked, joining me on the porch. I considered the question. Was I okay? The hollow feeling that had defined my existence since Sarah's death was still there, but different somehow. Less like an emptiness and more like a healing wound. "I will be," I answered honestly. "For the first time in a long time, I think I actually will be." He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Whatever that thing was, it didn't get what it came for. "No," I agreed. "It didn't." But as Matt went back inside, I found myself wondering if that was entirely true. The walker might not have taken my identity, my place in the world, but it had taken something. The paralyzing grief that had consumed me for nearly a year. The void that had made me vulnerable in the first place. In trying to devour me, it had inadvertently forced me to remember who I was beyond my loss. To reclaim the parts of myself I'd surrendered to grief. As the last light faded from the sky, I whispered into the gathering darkness. Thank you, Sarah, for helping me fight, for helping me remember how to live." There was no response, no mystical sign, no ghostly presence, just the ordinary sounds of the forest at dusk. And for the first time since her death, that felt like enough. I turned and went back inside to join my friends, leaving the shadows of Shawnee Forest, and perhaps some of my own, behind. We never returned to Shawnee National Forest. Eliza's ankle healed, and Matt's nightmares about the wind and the chanting eventually subsided. Jamie threw herself into researching the Walker legend, though she found little beyond vague folk tales and second-hand accounts. As for me, I still carry the memory of that weekend like a scar, visible but no longer painful. Sometimes when I'm between sleep and waking, I think I hear Sarah's voice calling my name, and for a moment, I'm back in that moonlit clearing, faced with the choice between hollow comfort and hard reality. I choose reality every time. I choose to remember Sarah as she truly was. Not the perfect, static image the Walker offered, but the complex, vibrant woman who lived and loved and left too soon. And on those rare occasions when I feel that familiar disconnection starting to creep in, that sense of floating above my own life rather than living it, I reach for the memories that saved me. Milan, Wisconsin, wedding speeches and stolen marshmallows. The small human connections that anchor us to ourselves and to each other. Because I know now what I didn't fully understand before. The Walker isn't just a creature that haunts the woods of southern Illinois. It's the emptiness that follows loss. The temptation to surrender to grief rather than endure it. The hollow comfort of never moving forward. And its greatest power isn't supernatural at all. It's our own willingness to disappear. My name is Rebecca Harlow, and I am 32 years old. This happened in June 2024. The crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth filled my lungs as I stepped out of my car. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders despite the warm breeze. Something about this place, the dense tree line of the Shawnee National Forest looming before me, sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Come on, girl," I called to Luna, my German shepherd. She bounded out of the back seat, her tail wagging with excitement as she sniffed the air. At least one of us was looking forward to this trip. It had been 6 months since Mark's death. 6 months of staring at the walls of our Chicago apartment. Of well-meaning friends stopping by with casseroles and concerned looks. 6 months of therapy sessions where I nodded along to suggestions about finding closure and healing through nature. So here I was, following Dr. Patterson's advice to reconnect with the outdoors, to find some peace in the secluded trails of southern Illinois. Garden of the Gods, the sign read at the trailhead. An appropriate name for the towering sandstone formations that had drawn me here. I'd chosen this specific trail after hours of research, remote enough to avoid weekend crowds, but well-marked enough that even my city-dweller navigation skills could handle it. The plan was simple. A 3-day backpacking trip along the river-to-river trail, camping at designated sites, with Luna as my only companion. I secured my backpack, checked my water supply, and made sure Luna's harness was properly adjusted. The weight of the pack felt good, grounding. It had been years since Mark and I had gone hiking together. Those trips had always been his idea. He was the outdoorsy one, the one who knew how to start a fire with nothing but sticks and determination. I had been more of a reluctant participant, preferring the comforts of a hotel room to a tent on hard ground. But now I needed this. Needed to prove to myself that I could do it alone, that I could still function in a world without him. "Let's go, Luna," I said, heading toward the trailhead. Luna trotted happily beside me, her presence reassuring as we passed under the canopy of trees. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was exactly as advertised, challenging in spots, with rocky inclines and narrow paths along steep drops, but clearly marked with white diamond blazes on trees. The sandstone formations rose around us like ancient sentinels, their surfaces eroded into fantastic shapes by millennia of wind and rain. By late afternoon, my legs were pleasantly tired, and I'd found a rhythm in my steps. For the first time in months, my mind wasn't consumed with grief. Instead, I was focused on the path ahead, on the shifting light through the trees, on Luna's occasional alerts at squirrels or birds. We reached the first designated camping area as the sun began its descent behind the tree line. It was a small cleared area near Buzzard's Point with a fire ring and enough flat ground for my tent. I set up camp efficiently, if not gracefully, following the mental checklist I'd memorized from Mark's old camping guides. As darkness fell, I lit a small fire and heated some dehydrated pasta, sharing a bit with Luna, who sat alertly at my side. The forest had grown quiet, except for the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures and the distant hoot of an owl. "We did it, girl," I murmured to Luna, scratching behind her ears. "Day 1 complete." That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to listen. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the vast darkness. "Is someone there?" No response. Luna's ears had perked up, her body tensing as she stared into the dense tree line beyond our campsite. "It's nothing," I told her, trying to convince myself as much as her. "Just the wind." I doused the fire and retreated to my tent, zipping it securely closed. Luna curled up at my feet, her warmth comforting as exhaustion pulled me toward sleep. Just before consciousness slipped away, I could have sworn I heard that whisper again, closer now, almost at the tent's thin wall, but I was too tired to be afraid. I stumbled through the forest, Luna limping slightly beside me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the night was fading, leaving me shaky and disoriented. My only compass was the rising sun. I headed east, reasoning that we'd eventually hit a road or trail if we maintained a consistent direction. The human servants we'd left behind didn't follow. I glimpsed them occasionally through the trees, wandering aimlessly or simply standing in place, as if their minds couldn't process what had happened to them. I wondered how many were like Eleanor, lost hikers who had been caught in the fallen's web, and how many were locals who had stumbled upon the wrong part of the forest at the wrong time. After about an hour of walking, Luna suddenly perked up, her ears forward, nose testing the air. She woofed softly and changed direction, heading northeast. I followed, trusting her instincts more than my own at this point. "What is it, girl?" I asked, hope rising as her pace quickened despite her injury. 20 minutes later, we emerged from the tree line onto a gravel road. Relief flooded through me at this first sign of civilization, though the road was empty in both directions with no indication of where it might lead. "Which way?" I asked Luna as if she could answer. She sniffed the air, then turned left, trotting with renewed energy. I followed, my legs protesting after the night's exertions. We'd been walking for perhaps half an hour when I heard the blessed sound of an approaching vehicle. An old blue pickup truck appeared around a bend, slowing as the driver spotted us. The truck pulled alongside, and a weathered face peered out from the driver's window, an elderly man with skin tanned to leather by years of outdoor work. His eyes widened as he took in my disheveled appearance. "You all right, miss?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I got lost hiking," I explained, the simplest truth I could offer. "My dog and I have been out all night." He nodded, as if this was explanation enough. "Where you headed?" "Anywhere with a phone," I said. "I need to call for a ride back to my car at Garden of the Gods." The man's expression changed subtly at the mention of the location. "You were out near Jackson Falls?" I nodded, watching his reaction carefully. He sighed, shaking his head. "Folks ought to know better than to camp out that way, especially alone." He reached across to open the passenger door. "Hop in. I can take you to Dixon Springs. There's a ranger station there with a phone." I hesitated only briefly before climbing in, Luna jumping into the truck bed with a little assistance. The warmth of the cab was heavenly after the cool morning air. "Name's Earl Whitaker," the man said as he put the truck in gear. "Been living in these parts all my life." "Rebecca Harlow," I replied, then added, "What did you mean about people knowing better than to camp out that way?" Earl was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. "That part of the forest has a bad reputation," he finally said. "Has for as long as I can remember, even before the accident in '63. My heart rate quickened. "What accident?" "Mining accident. Tunnels ran all through this region back then. One of them collapsed not far from Jackson Falls, flooded from an underground spring. 12 men drowned before they could be rescued." He glanced at me. "Since then, hikers go missing in those woods more often than the Forestry Service likes to admit. Some turn up later, not quite right in the head. Some never turn up at all." "And the locals know to avoid it?" I asked. Earl nodded. "Most do. But tourists, folks from up north," he shrugged. "They see a pretty waterfall on a map, don't think twice about it." "Have you ever seen anything strange out there?" I ventured. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Once, about 40 years ago. Was hunting with my brother when we came across what looked like a man standing in the creek near Jackson Falls. Wasn't moving, just standing there staring at us. Water up to his chest, middle of winter." Earl's voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "We called out to him, thinking he needed help. That's when he smiled. Wasn't a human smile, miss. And his eyes." He shook his head as if to dislodge the memory. "What happened?" I prompted when he fell silent. "We ran. Never went back to that part of the forest. Sam, my brother, he was never the same after. Started hearing things, saying the man from the creek was calling to him. Found him 3 times trying to walk back to those woods in the middle of the night. 4th time, couldn't stop him." Earl's voice caught. "They found his body a week later, washed up downstream from the falls." The rest of the drive passed in uncomfortable silence, the weight of Earl's story hanging between us. I wanted to tell him what I'd experienced, to confirm that he wasn't alone in his encounter with the impossible, but something held me back. Perhaps the fear that speaking it aloud would make it more real, would somehow allow it to follow me beyond the boundaries of the forest. Dixon Springs was little more than a cluster of buildings, a small general store, a gas station, and the promised ranger station. Earl pulled up in front of the latter, putting the truck in park but leaving the engine running. "Thank you," I said sincerely, "for the ride and for the warning, even if it came too late." He studied me with eyes that had seen too much. "You saw something out there, didn't you? Something that wasn't right?" I hesitated, then nodded slowly. Earl reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, worn at the edges. "This here's a woman who studies the strange happenings in these parts, professor at Southern Illinois University. If you want to talk to someone who might believe whatever it is you saw, she's your best bet." I took the card, reading the name, Dr. Meredith Ainsley, Department of Anthropology and Folklore Studies. "Why do you carry her card?" I asked. A sad smile crossed Earl's weathered face. "Been trying to work up the courage to call her myself for 40 years. Maybe you're braver than I am." Before I could respond, he reached across me to open the passenger door. "Take care of yourself, Miss Harlow, and that dog of yours. Not everyone who goes into those woods comes out with their companions." I climbed out, helping Luna down from the truck bed. Earl gave me a final nod before driving away, leaving us standing in the parking lot of the ranger station. Inside, the ranger on duty, a young woman named Carla, was sympathetic to my story of getting lost while hiking. She allowed me to use the phone to call a taxi service from the nearest town, then examined Luna's wound. "She'll be okay," Carla assured me, applying an antiseptic ointment and a bandage to the gash. "But you should have a vet look at this when you get home. Make sure it doesn't get infected." While we waited for the taxi, I studied the map of Shawnee National Forest on the wall of the station. The Garden of the Gods where I'd parked my car was marked clearly, as was Jackson Falls. Between them lay an area shaded slightly darker than the rest, with fewer trails marked. "What's this area?" I asked Carla, pointing to the shaded region. She glanced up from her paperwork. "That's the old grove, not officially part of any trail system. Too dangerous, unstable ground from the old mining tunnels underneath." "Do people go missing there?" I asked. "Aye." Carla's expression became guarded. "Occasionally, hikers stray off trail, yes. Usually we find them within a day or two." "Usually," I repeated, "but not always." She sighed, setting down her pen. "Look, every national forest has its share of missing persons cases. People underestimate the wilderness. Come unprepared, make bad decisions. It happens." "And the mining accident in 1963? The 12 men who drowned?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You've been talking to the locals, I see." She stood, moving to a bookshelf in the corner of the office. "That was before my time, of course, but the station keeps records of major incidents." She returned with a thin file folder, opening it on the desk. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings and what appeared to be official reports typed on onion skin paper. "The Blackwood Mine Collapse," she said, tapping one of the headlines. "March 15, 1963. Heavy rains had destabilized the tunnel system, but the company insisted on continuing operations. When the main shaft collapsed, it cut off the escape route for a dozen miners and exposed a previously unknown underground spring. The tunnels flooded within minutes." I leaned closer, examining the grainy newspaper photo of the 12 men who had died. Their faces stared back at me, solemn in the way people often looked in photographs from that era. Ordinary men, sons, husbands, fathers, who had gone to work one day and never returned. "Recovery efforts continued for 2 weeks," Carla continued, "but they never found the bodies. The mine was sealed off after that, deemed too dangerous for further operations." Something cold settled in the pit of my stomach. "They never found the bodies," I repeated, "so they're still down there, underwater." Carla nodded, seemingly untroubled by this fact. "Most likely, yes. It happens in mining disasters sometimes." I thought of the pale figures rising from the pool, of Not Mark's words, those who drowned when the old mining tunnels flooded back in '63. They've been taking hikers for decades. Could it be that simple? The unquiet dead of a mining disaster, somehow transformed by decades underwater into something no longer fully human. The taxi arrived before I could pursue this line of thought further. I thanked Carla for her help, tucking Dr. Ainsley's business card safely into my pocket, and headed out with Luna to begin the journey back to civilization. The ride to Garden of the Gods was quiet, the taxi driver making only minimal conversation. My car was still in the parking lot, untouched but for a parking ticket tucked under the windshield wiper, an incongruously normal problem after the horrors of the night. Once Luna was settled in the back seat, I sat behind the wheel, hands gripping it tightly as I tried to process everything that had happened. The rational part of my mind wanted to explain it away as exhaustion, fear, and grief combining to create hallucinations. But Luna's bandaged wound was real enough, as was the bone-deep certainty that we had encountered something beyond normal explanation. I started the car, pulling out of the parking lot with no small amount of relief. As the road curved away from the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For an instant, I thought I saw a figure standing at the tree line. Tall, thin, with the suggestion of Mark's features, but when I blinked, it was gone. "We're going home, Luna," I said, pressing down on the accelerator. "We're leaving this place behind." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't true. The card in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole, demanding attention. Dr. Meredith Ainsley, who studied strange happenings in the region, who might have answers or at least theories about what lurked in the waters of Jackson Falls. More importantly, I knew others would come after me. Hikers, campers, tourists drawn to the beauty of the forest without knowledge of its dangers. How many had the fallen taken over the decades? How many more would they take if no one tried to stop them? The loss of Mark had left me adrift, searching for purpose. Perhaps I had found it in the most unexpected of places, in a forest where the dead didn't stay buried, where grief became a weapon to be used against the living. I reached over to scratch Luna behind the ears, taking comfort in her solid presence. "What do you think, girl? Should we make a stop in Carbondale on our way home? Talk to this professor?" Luna whined softly, leaning into my touch. "Yeah," I said, watching the forest recede in my mirrors. "I think so, too." Whatever haunted the depths of Jackson Falls, whatever had worn my husband's face to lure me to a watery grave, it was still there, waiting, watching, whispering to those who could hear. And now I knew its voice. It took 3 days to work up the courage to call Dr. Ainsley. 3 days of jumping at shadows, of waking in the middle of the night convinced I could hear whispers coming from the bathroom sink, the kitchen faucet, the toilet bowl. 3 days of keeping Luna close, drawing strength from her uncomplicated loyalty. When I finally dialed the number on Earl's worn business card, I half expected it to be disconnected. Instead, a brisk female voice answered on the third ring. "Dr. Ainsley, speaking." "My name is Rebecca Harlow," I said, words rehearsed a dozen times still stumbling on my tongue. "Earl Whitaker gave me your card. He said you study unusual occurrences in the Shawnee National Forest." A pause, then. "I research folkloric phenomena in southern Illinois, yes. May I ask what this is regarding? How to explain? How to compress the terror of that night into words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a traumatized mind? I was hiking near Jackson Falls," I began cautiously. "I saw something there, something that shouldn't exist." Another pause, longer this time. When Dr. Ainsley spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional detachment. "Miss Harlow, I have office hours tomorrow from 2 to 4. If you're able to come to campus, I think we should speak in person." The following day found me navigating the campus of Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Luna left reluctantly with a pet sitter. Dr. Ainsley's office was in a corner of the anthropology building, its door plastered with cartoons and newspaper clippings about folklore and urban legends. The woman who opened the door at my knock was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd pictured someone ethereal, perhaps, with flowing scarves and crystal jewelry. Instead, Dr. Meredith Ainsley was a compact woman in her 50s with short silver hair, sharp eyes behind practical glasses, and the no-nonsense manner of someone who had spent decades fighting to be taken seriously. "Ms. Harlow," she said, gesturing me inside. "Please, sit." The office was organized chaos. Bookshelves crammed with volumes on folklore, anthropology, parapsychology. One wall was covered in a map of southern Illinois, red pins marking locations throughout the region. "Earl Whitaker gave you my contact information," she said, taking a seat behind her desk. "Interesting. I've been trying to interview him for years about his experience at Jackson Falls. He said he's been carrying your card for 40 years. A smile flickered across her face. Some witnesses aren't ready to talk until they meet someone else who's seen what they've seen. She leaned forward. "So, tell me, Ms. Harlow, what did you see in the forest?" I told her everything. The whispers, the stone cabin, Luna's disappearance, the drowned figures rising from the pool, the thing wearing Mark's face. As I spoke, Dr. Ainsley took notes, occasionally nodding but never interrupting. She didn't react with disbelief or concern for my mental state, which was more validating than I could have expressed. When I finished, she sat back, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Your experience aligns with several accounts I've collected over the years," she said finally. "The details differ, but the core elements remain consistent. Voices in the water, figures that shouldn't exist, familiar faces used as lures." "Then I'm not the first," I said, relieved and disturbed in equal measure. "Far from it." She turned to the map on her wall, indicating the cluster of red pins around Jackson Falls. Each of these represents a reported encounter dating back to the 1960s. Most witnesses aren't as unfortunate as you were." "You mean they didn't escape?" Dr. Ainsley's expression was grave. "I mean they didn't survive with their minds intact. Those who return from extended contact with what you encountered tend to exhibit symptoms similar to severe dissociative disorders. They speak of voices calling them back to the water, of promises made by the dead." "Like Eleanor," I murmured, "the woman in the forest." "Eleanor Gaines," Dr. Ainsley confirmed, pulling a file from her desk drawer. "Reported missing 3 weeks ago while hiking alone. You're saying she's still alive?" "She was when I last saw her, but they were taking her to the pool." Dr. Ainsley made a note. "I'll contact the Forestry Service, have them expand their search parameters." She looked up at me. "Though I doubt they'll find her. Not if the Fallen have claimed her." "The Fallen," I repeated. "That's what Eleanor called them too. The miners who drowned in 1963. That's the prevailing theory among those of us who study this phenomenon, yes." She gestured to the books around us. "Every culture has stories of the drowned dead who return to claim the living. The Ich Uij in Scotland, the Kappa in Japan, the Nek in Scandinavia. Bodies of water as liminal spaces between life and death." "But these aren't just stories," I insisted. "These are real people who died in a mining accident." "And that may be what makes them different and more dangerous than folkloric water spirits," Dr. Ainsley agreed. "They remember being human. They understand human grief, human longing, and they use it." The implication hung in the air between us. "You're saying my grief for Mark made me a target." She nodded slowly. "The recently bereaved seem particularly vulnerable to their influence. The Fallen use that connection, that raw wound as you described it, to create a bridge between their world and ours. They appear as lost loved ones, exploiting emotional connections to lure new victims to the water." "But I escaped," I said. "I rejected the thing pretending to be Mark, which makes you unique among my case studies." Dr. Ainsley leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Ms. Harlow, I'd like to formally interview you about your experience. Document it thoroughly. It could be invaluable to my research." "Research to what end? To prove these things exist?" She shook her head. "To find a way to stop them. To understand their limitations, their weaknesses, to prevent more disappearances." I thought of the terror of that night, of the thing with Mark's face dissolving in the morning light, of Eleanor being dragged away to a fate worse than death. "They're vulnerable to sunlight," I said, "and they seemed disrupted when I rejected their version of Mark, when I refused to give them my grief." "Exactly the kind of information that could help," Dr. Ainsley said eagerly. "If we understand them better, maybe we can find a way to lay them to rest permanently." "Or warn people to stay away," I suggested. Her expression turned sardonic. "Do you know how hard it is to get official acknowledgement of unexplained phenomena? The Forestry Service barely admits to normal disappearances in the area, let alone ones with supernatural causes. The best I've managed is to get some trails officially closed due to ground instability." I remembered the darker shaded area on the ranger station map. The old grove. "Yes, it helps, but tourists still wander off trail, still hear the whispers." She sighed, removing her glasses to rub the bridge of her nose. "And I suspect the Fallen's influence is growing. The incidents are becoming more frequent, occurring farther from Jackson Falls." A chill ran through me. "They told Eleanor they wanted to break free of the pool, to walk beyond the boundaries of the forest." Dr. Ainsley's head snapped up. "That's new information. Concerning information." She made another note. "If they're becoming more ambitious, more capable of extending their reach, then more people are in danger," I finished for her. She nodded grimly. "Which is why your account is so valuable. You encountered them at their strongest, at night in their territory, and yet you rejected them. You survived with your mind intact." "Because I refused to let them have my grief for Mark," I said slowly, understanding dawning. "I claimed it as my own. Exactly. Dr. Ainsley leaned back in her chair. The question is, can others be taught to do the same? Or is there something unique about you that allowed you to break their hold? I had no answer for that. I wasn't special, just a woman who had lost her husband and was learning, painfully, to live without him. Perhaps that was it. I had already begun the work of grief before entering the forest, had already taken the first steps on the long road to acceptance. What happens now? I asked. Now, Doctor, Ainsley said, closing her notebook. I continue my research, and you decide if you want to be part of it. What do you mean? I mean that most people who encounter the fallen either don't survive or spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they saw. You've demonstrated a remarkable resilience, a connection to them without being controlled by them. She met my gaze directly. You could help me understand them, perhaps even help me find a way to stop them. It was an unexpected offer, to deliberately engage with the horror I'd so narrowly escaped. The rational choice would be to return to Chicago, to resume my life, to file away the experience as a nightmare never to be revisited. But I thought of Eleanor, of the vacant-eyed servants in the forest, of Earl Whitaker's brother who had heard the whispers calling him back. I thought of future hikers who might wander too close to Jackson Falls, who might hear their dead loved ones calling from the water. What exactly would helping you entail? I asked cautiously. Dr. Ainsley smiled as if she'd expected the question. For now, just a series of interviews. Your detailed account of what happened, what you saw, what you felt. Later, perhaps, visits to the periphery of the affected area. Always in daylight, always with proper precautions. She held up a hand at my expression. I'm not suggesting we confront them directly. I'm not that foolhardy. I wasn't convinced, but curiosity and a sense of responsibility I hadn't anticipated pushed me forward. And you think this could actually help? Could stop them from taking more people? I think it's our best chance, she said simply. In 40 years of studying this phenomenon, I've never met someone like you. Someone who faced them and walked away. Who saw through their deception. Put that way, it was hard to refuse. If my experience could prevent others from suffering Eleanor's fate, didn't I have an obligation to share it? I'll help, I said finally, as much as I can, but I have conditions. Name them. I'm not going back to Jackson Falls, not to the pool, not where they could, I swallowed hard, not where they could try to use Mark against me again. Dr. Ainsley nodded. Agreed, no direct contact with the primary site. And Luna comes with me for any field research. She warned me about them, sensed their wrongness before I could. I trust her instincts. A smile touched Dr. Ainsley's lips. Dogs often perceive what humans cannot. I have no objection to your companion joining us. Then I guess I'm in, I said, still not quite believing I was agreeing to this. Where do we start? Dr. Ainsley's expression turned grave. We start with the truth, Ms. Harlow. The uncomfortable truth that what you encountered in the forest is just one manifestation of something larger and older than the Blackwood mine disaster. The miners who became the fallen didn't create the phenomenon. They were transformed by it. What do you mean? She stood, moving to a bookshelf and selecting a weathered volume. Indigenous accounts from this region speak of a place where the water remembers the dead, where those who died with unfinished business could return, could speak to the living through the ripples of lakes and streams. She opened the book, showing me a page of handwritten notes. The Shawnee called it the Hollow Water, a place to be both revered and feared. So, this has been happening since before the mining accident? Since before European settlement? In some form, yes, though the current manifestation, the fallen, as they're known locally, seems to have begun with the miners. She returned the book to its shelf. What troubles me is the escalation. For decades, the phenomenon was contained to the immediate vicinity of Jackson Falls. Now it's spreading. Why? What's changed? Dr. Ainsley sighed, returning to her desk. That's what we need to discover. Something has disturbed the balance, has given the fallen new strength, new ambition. Unless we identify that catalyst, I fear their influence will continue to grow. I thought of Notmark's words. Your grief is like fuel to them. Could it be as simple as more people visiting the forest? More grief for them to feed on? Perhaps. Or climate change affecting the underground water systems, or industrial pollution, or any number of factors we haven't yet considered. She shrugged. Hence the research. As I left Dr. Ainsley's office that afternoon, I felt both burdened and lightened. Burdened by the responsibility I'd taken on, but lightened by the knowledge that I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. That there was a framework, however tentative, for understanding the horror in the forest. I would return to Chicago the next day, to my job and my apartment and the life I was rebuilding. But I would return changed, aware now of depths and dangers I had never imagined. Aware that grief could be a weapon turned against the grieving, but also a shield when claimed and owned. The thing in the forest had tried to use Mark against me, had twisted my love for him into a lure, a trap. Its mistake had been in underestimating the strength that love gave me, not just the grief, but the memory of who Mark had truly been. A man who would never have asked me to surrender my life for his sake. As I drove away from the university, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a familiar figure standing on the roadside. But there was nothing, just the ordinary world going about its business, unaware of what lurked in the dark waters of the forest. For now, at least, the whispers had fallen silent. But I knew they were still there, still calling to those who could hear them. And I knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that I would hear them again. Next time, though, I wouldn't be unprepared. Next time, I would be the one hunting the hunters. For Mark, for Eleanor, for all those who had been lost to the depths. The fallen had made a mistake when they chose me as their target. They had awakened something they couldn't control. Not grief alone, but determination, resolve, purpose. My name is Rebecca Harlow. I am 32 years old, and I am no longer afraid of the dark water. Morning arrived with a chill mist that clung to the forest floor. I awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where I was until Luna's wet nose nudged my cheek. The events of the previous night seemed distant and dreamlike in the soft morning light. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, stretching my arms above my head. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. My backpack hung from a tree branch to keep food away from curious animals, the fire ring cold and gray. Nothing out of place, nothing to suggest we'd had visitors in the night. "Breakfast time, Luna," I said, reaching for my pack. But when I opened the food pouch, I froze. The sealed bag of trail mix I'd planned for breakfast had been torn open, its contents scattered. Yet the pack had been untouched, still hanging exactly where I'd left it. "Strange," I muttered, examining the pack for signs of animal intrusion. There were none. I glanced at Luna, who was sniffing the ground near the edge of our campsite, her behavior normal and unconcerned. I wrote it off as my own carelessness. Perhaps I'd damaged the package when packing, and made do with an energy bar instead. After a quick breakfast and breaking down camp, we set off for day 2 of our journey, heading deeper into the forest toward Jackson Falls. The trail grew more difficult as we progressed, narrower and less defined. Twice I had to backtrack when I lost sight of the trail markers. The forest seemed different today, denser, more watchful. The tree branches hung lower, creating natural archways that we ducked under. I couldn't shake the feeling that with each arch we were crossing thresholds into increasingly remote territory. By midday, the sun had risen high enough to penetrate the canopy, casting dappled light across the forest floor. We stopped by a small stream for lunch, and I consulted my map. According to my calculations, we were on track to reach the next camping area by late afternoon. As Luna drank from the stream, I noticed something odd about the water. It wasn't flowing as it should have been. Instead, it seemed to move in small, circular patterns, as if disturbed by unseen forces. I blinked hard, attributing the strange sight to fatigue or perhaps a trick of the light. We continued our trek, but I couldn't ignore a growing sense of unease. The forest had become eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even Luna seemed affected, staying closer to my side than usual, her tail no longer wagging with enthusiasm. "It's okay, girl," I assured her, though the words felt hollow in the silent forest. As the afternoon wore on, my GPS began to act strangely. The screen flickered between our location and random points on the map, making it increasingly difficult to navigate. I switched to my paper map and compass, feeling a surge of gratitude for Mark's insistence that I learn basic orienteering. That's when I noticed the first carving, a crude symbol etched into the trunk of a massive oak tree. It resembled a distorted face, its features twisted in what might have been pain or rage. I ran my fingers over the grooves, trying to determine how old it might be. The edges were weathered, suggesting it had been there for some time, yet something about it felt fresh, as if the tree were still bleeding from the wound. "Let's keep moving," I muttered to Luna, who was growling softly at the marked tree. As we progressed, I noticed more carvings, similar symbols appearing on trees at irregular intervals along the trail, sometimes accompanied by words in a language I couldn't identify, letters that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. By late afternoon, when we should have reached Jackson Falls, I realized we were lost. The trail had disappeared entirely, replaced by a barely discernible path through increasingly dense vegetation. The white diamond blazes were gone, and checking my map offered no clarity. Nothing in the surrounding landscape matched what was depicted. Panic began to rise in my chest, a tightening sensation that made it difficult to breathe. I forced myself to stop, to take deep breaths and think rationally. Getting lost was a common occurrence for hikers. The solution was simple: retrace our steps until we found the marked trail again. But when I turned around, the path we had followed had vanished, swallowed by the thickening forest. Luna whined, pressing against my leg as if seeking reassurance. "It's okay," I said again, my voice shaking. "We'll figure this out." I decided to head west, reasoning that if we kept moving in one direction, we'd eventually hit one of the main trails or a road. The sun, now low in the sky, provided some orientation, though the dense canopy made it difficult to track its position consistently. After an hour of pushing through underbrush and climbing over fallen logs, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood what appeared to be the remains of a stone cabin, its roof long collapsed, its walls crumbling and covered in moss. Something about the structure seemed wrong, its angles slightly off, creating an unsettling effect that was difficult to pinpoint. Night was approaching rapidly, and with no better options available, I decided we would camp near the ruins. Not inside, something instinctive warned me against that, but close enough to use the remaining wall as a windbreak. I set up the tent with trembling hands, my earlier confidence replaced by a gnawing fear that I refused to acknowledge. Luna refused to settle, pacing the perimeter of our camp, her hackles raised. "What is it, girl?" I asked, following her gaze into the darkening forest. "Do you see something?" As if in response, a whisper drifted from the trees. The same sound I'd heard the previous night, but clearer now. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, or perhaps multiple voices, speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. I retreated to the tent, pulling Luna inside with me. The temperature had dropped dramatically with nightfall, and I huddled in my sleeping bag, grateful for Luna's warmth beside me. I tried the GPS again, but the screen remained dark. The battery had died, despite being fully charged that morning. My phone showed no service, as expected in this remote area, but I was disturbed to find that it, too, had lost power. Even my watch had stopped, its hands frozen at 6:13. Outside, the whispers continued, rising and falling like waves on a shoreline. Against my better judgment, I pressed my ear to the tent fabric, straining to make out words. "Found her," I thought I heard. "Just like the others." I jerked back, heart pounding. My imagination was getting the best of me, I decided. Sleep deprivation and the stress of being lost were affecting my perception. "We'll find our way out tomorrow," I whispered to Luna, who had finally settled down, though her eyes remained alert, tracking movements I couldn't see outside the tent. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but every sound from the forest, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, jolted me back to alertness. Hours passed this way, in a half-conscious state between wakefulness and dreams. It must have been around midnight when Luna suddenly grew rigid beside me, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Before I could react, she barked sharply, once, twice, then fell silent with a whimper that chilled my blood. Something was moving outside the tent. Not the subtle movements of forest creatures, but heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. They paused occasionally, as if their owner was inspecting our belongings, then continued their steady circuit. I lay perfectly still, not daring to breathe. Luna pressed against me, trembling now, her earlier bravado gone. The footsteps completed a full circle around the tent, then stopped directly in front of the zippered entrance. Time stretched into an eternity as I waited, every muscle tensed for flight. Then, incredibly, I heard what sounded like sniffing, deep, animal-like inhalations that suggested whatever stood outside was catching our scent. A shadow fell across the tent fabric, a silhouette illuminated by the moon. It was vaguely human in shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed elongated beyond natural proportions. Then a voice spoke, so close it might have been inside the tent with us. "Rebecca," it said, my name twisted into something unrecognizable in its mouth. Rebecca Harlow. It knew my name. How could it know my name? The zipper of the tent began to move, rising slowly upward as if pulled by an unseen hand. Luna's growl turned into a snarl, and she lunged toward the opening, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "Luna, no!" I cried, but too late. She shot through the partially open tent flap into the darkness beyond. There was a flurry of movement, a yelp of pain, then silence. Terrible, absolute silence. "Luna!" I called, my voice breaking. "Luna!" Nothing. Not even the whispers remained. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The beam cut through the darkness as I cautiously peered outside the tent. The clearing was empty. No sign of Luna, no sign of the figure that had stood outside. Even the ruins of the stone cabin seemed different somehow, smaller, more decayed, as if years had passed in the span of minutes. "Luna!" I called again, louder this time, desperation making me reckless. The forest absorbed my voice, swallowing it whole. I stepped fully outside the tent, sweeping the flashlight beam in wide arcs across the clearing and into the tree line. That's when I saw the blood. Dark spatters on the fallen leaves leading into the forest. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to wait for dawn, but I couldn't abandon Luna. She was all I had left. Clutching the flashlight like a weapon, I followed the blood trail into the trees. The path it created was eerily straight, cutting through the underbrush as if whoever, or whatever, had taken Luna wanted me to follow. The rational part of my mind recognized the danger, but grief and fear had formed an alliance that silenced caution. The trail led deeper into the forest, toward what appeared to be the entrance to a ravine. Jackson Falls, I realized with a jolt. We had been closer to our intended destination than I'd thought. But this wasn't the Jackson Falls depicted in the guidebooks. The waterfall that should have cascaded gracefully over the rocks was reduced to a trickle. The pool beneath stained a rusty brown. The surrounding cliffs were carved with the same symbols I'd seen on the trees. hundreds of them overlapping to create a mural of distorted faces and indecipherable script. The blood trail ended at the edge of the pool. I shone my flashlight across the dark water, dreading what I might see floating on its surface. But there was nothing. No sign of Luna, no indication of what might have happened to her. "Please," I whispered, though to whom or what I wasn't sure. "Please, give her back." A splash disrupted the stillness, sending ripples across the pool. Something had moved beneath the surface. I leaned forward, trying to penetrate the murky depths with my flashlight beam. Another splash, closer now. Then a hand, unmistakably human, broke the surface, fingers grasping at air before slipping back beneath the water. I stumbled backward, a scream trapped in my throat. Before I could recover, the hand appeared again, followed by an arm, a shoulder, a head, a man pulling himself from the pool with agonizing slowness. He stood upright, water streaming from a body that appeared normal at first glance. But as he stepped forward into the full beam of my flashlight, I saw that his skin had the pale, bloated appearance of something that had been submerged for far too long. His eyes were milky white, pupils barely visible behind clouded corneas, and his face, God, his face was Mark's. "No," I choked out, backing away. "You're not real. You're not him." The thing that wore my dead husband's face tilted its head, a grotesque parody of the gesture Mark used to make when confused. "Rebecca," it said in Mark's voice with Mark's inflection, "why did you leave me behind?" "You died," I said, my back pressing against the rocky wall of the ravine. There was nothing I could do. It stepped closer, leaving wet footprints that seemed to steam in the cool night air. "I'm so cold, Rebecca. I've been waiting for you here. It took you so long to come." Tears blurred my vision, grief and terror waging war within me. Some irrational part of me wanted to reach out, to touch the familiar face despite its wrongness. But then I saw what followed him from the water. Pale, elongated figures rising one by one from the pool, their features indistinct except for those same milky eyes. "The others have been waiting too," the thing that wasn't Mark said. "The ones who came before, the ones who heard the whispers and followed them here." The figures moved with unnatural grace, arranging themselves in a semicircle behind not Mark. There were perhaps a dozen of them, men and women of various ages, all bearing the signs of long submersion. "What do you want?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "Company," not Mark replied simply. "It's lonely in the depths." I searched desperately for an escape route, but the drowned ones had positioned themselves to block the only path out of the ravine. My gaze darted to the cliffs above, too steep to climb, especially in darkness. "Where's Luna?" I demanded, stalling for time as I inched sideways along the ravine wall. Not Mark's face twisted into an approximation of sadness. "She wouldn't join us. Animals never do. They sense the wrongness." He gestured vaguely toward the forest. "She ran. Unlike her owner, she knew better than to follow the voices." Relief flooded through me at the thought that Luna might have escaped, might still be alive somewhere in the forest. It gave me strength, cleared my head enough to notice a narrow gap between two of the pale figures, a potential path to freedom if I was fast enough. "You don't belong here, Rebecca," not Mark continued, moving closer still. Water dripped from his outstretched fingers, sizzling when it hit the ground. "You belong with me. Belong. With us. In the depths." I tensed, preparing to run, but not Mark lunged forward with impossible speed, his cold, wet hands closing around my wrists. His touch burned like ice, sending pain shooting up my arms. "No!" I screamed, wrenching free with strength born of pure terror. I stumbled backward, then turned and sprinted toward the gap between the pale figures, expecting at any moment to feel those burning cold hands on me again. But I made it through, the drowned ones slower to react than their leader. I ran blindly into the forest, away from the ravine, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, not with the clumsy crashing of humans through underbrush, but with an almost silent grace that somehow made their pursuit more terrifying. The whispers had returned, louder now, a chorus of voices urging me to stop, to turn around, to give in. Some sounded like Mark, others were unfamiliar, but all carried the same hungry desperation. I didn't slow down, didn't look back. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. I had no direction in mind beyond away, away from the pool, away from the thing wearing my husband's face, away from the terrible truth that perhaps some part of Mark really did linger in those depths. How long I ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that endless night. Eventually, I collapsed against a tree trunk, physically unable to go further. I strained to listen for sounds of pursuit, but heard only my own ragged breathing and the renewed silence of the forest. Had I lost them? Or were they simply approaching with that unnatural silence, preparing to close in? A branch snapped somewhere to my left. I scrambled to my feet, ready to run again despite my exhaustion, but instead of one of the pale figures, a familiar shape emerged from the darkness. Luna, her fur matted with mud but otherwise unharmed. "Luna!" I cried in relief, dropping to my knees as she bounded toward me. She licked my face frantically, her whole body wiggling with joy at our reunion. I buried my face in her fur, allowing myself a moment of hope. If she had found me, perhaps she could lead us out of this nightmare forest. Dogs had better senses than humans, better instincts. "We need to get out of here, girl," I whispered, struggling back to my feet. "Can you find the way?" As if understanding, Luna turned and trotted a few paces in what seemed like a random direction, then looked back at me expectantly. I followed, having no better option. We moved through the forest at a steady pace, Luna leading with confidence I couldn't fathom. The darkness was gradually giving way to the gray light of pre-dawn, allowing me to see enough to avoid the worst obstacles. After what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, Luna stopped abruptly, growling low in her throat. Ahead of us, barely visible in the dim light, stood a familiar figure. Not Mark this time, but a woman in hiking gear, her back to us. "Hello," I called cautiously. "Are you lost too?" The figure turned slowly. She appeared to be in her 40s, with short gray hair and a weathered face that might once have been pretty. Normal, human, a blessed relief after the horrors of the night. But her eyes held a vacancy that sent a chill down my spine. "Are you Rebecca Harlow?" she asked, her voice flat. I hesitated, Luna's continuous growl a warning I couldn't ignore. "Who wants to know?" The woman smiled, the expression not reaching her empty eyes. "My name is Eleanor Gaines. I've been waiting for you." "Waiting for me? Why?" "They told me you would come. The voices in the water." She took a step toward me. "They've been calling to me for weeks, ever since I found this place. But they don't want me. They want you." Luna's growl deepened, and I put a restraining hand on her collar. "I don't understand." "The fallen," Eleanor said, as if this explained everything. "Those who drowned when the old mining tunnels flooded back in '63. They've been taking hikers for decades. Those who can hear their whispers, those who carry grief like an open wound." She tilted her head in that same disturbing manner not Mark had used. "Those like you, Rebecca." My mouth went dry. "How do you know these things? How do you know my name?" "They told me. They tell me everything." Eleanor's voice had taken on a sing-song quality. "They said you have something they need, something they can use to break free of the pool, to walk beyond the boundaries of the forest." What could I possibly have that they need? "Your grief," she said simply. "It's like fuel to them. Your husband died, didn't he? Recently enough that the wound is still raw. They can use that, shape themselves from it." Her smile widened. "They tried to use mine too, but my grief was too old, too settled. Yours is perfect." I took a step back, tugging Luna with me. There was something deeply wrong about Eleanor Gaines, a brittleness that suggested she might shatter if touched. "I'm leaving this forest," I said firmly. "Right now. You should come with us." Eleanor shook her head. "I can't leave. None of us can. Not without their permission." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a knife, its blade catching the growing light. "I'm sorry, but they promised I could go if I helped them get you," Luna barked sharply, placing herself between me and the woman with the knife. I backed away slowly, looking for an escape route. "You don't have to do this, Eleanor," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Whatever they've told you, they're lying. They won't let you go." Something flickered in those empty eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a moment of clarity. But it passed quickly, replaced by a determined blankness. "You don't understand. I've been here for 3 weeks. I can't spend another night listening to them, feeling them watching me. I need to go home." She lunged forward suddenly, the knife aimed at my chest. Luna intercepted her, teeth closing around her wrist. Eleanor screamed, dropping the knife as she tried to shake off the dog. I saw my chance and took it, darting past her to retrieve the fallen weapon. By the time I had it in hand, Luna had released the woman and returned to my side, her muzzle flecked with blood. Eleanor cradled her injured wrist, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, "they'll punish me if I fail. They'll drag me to the pool." Despite everything, I felt a surge of pity for this broken woman. "Come with us," I offered again. "We'll find a way out together." For a moment, hope brightened her features. Then her gaze shifted to something behind me, and terror replaced it. "They're here," she whispered. I turned to see what had frightened her and immediately wished I hadn't. The pale figures from the pool stood at the edge of the clearing, their leader, still wearing Mark's face, at the center. In the growing light of dawn, they looked even less human than before, their proportions subtly wrong, their skin translucent enough to reveal the suggestion of bones and organs beneath. "You ran," Mark said, his voice carrying a hint of admiration now. "Most don't get this far." Eleanor had fallen to her knees, sobbing. "I tried," she pleaded. "I did what you asked." "Not well enough," one of the other figures said, a woman with long hair that moved as if underwater despite the still air. Mark turned to Eleanor with an expression of regret that might have been convincing if not for the eager hunger beneath it. "You know the price of failure." "Eleanor." Before either of us could react, 2 of the pale figures darted forward with that same unnatural speed, seizing Eleanor by the arms. She screamed as their touch left frost-white handprints on her skin, her struggles weakening as whatever cold energy they possessed seeped into her. "No," I shouted, brandishing the knife. "Let her go." Mark regarded me with mild interest. "Would you trade places with her, Rebecca? Your life for hers?" "Neither of us needs to die," I said, backing away. Luna stayed close, her hackles raised, teeth bared at the intruders. The thing wearing my husband's face laughed, an awful, gurgling sound like water forced through a blocked drain. "Death? Is that what you think this is about?" He gestured to his followers who had begun dragging the now limp Eleanor toward the trees. "We don't offer death, Rebecca. We offer transformation, eternity in the depths." I kept backing away, knife raised. The eastern sky had lightened considerably. Full dawn wasn't far off. I wondered if these creatures were limited by daylight, if the sun might drive them back to their pool. Mark seemed to read my thoughts. "The sun won't save you," he said. "It only limits how far we can roam from the water. But we've prepared for that." He raised a hand, and from the surrounding trees stepped human figures. Not the pale, drowned ones, but ordinary men and women with the same vacant look Eleanor had worn. "Our helpers," Mark explained. "Those who weren't quite right for the transformation but still have their uses. They can walk in daylight. They can bring you back to us." I was surrounded now. The pale figures to one side, their human servants closing in from the other directions. Luna growled continuously, turning in circles as she tried to keep all threats in view. My mind raced, searching for a solution. The knife seemed woefully inadequate against so many. Running wasn't an option. The servants might be ordinary humans, but there were at least 8 of them, and they knew this forest far better than I did. Then I remembered something Eleanor had said. They want you. Not just anyone, me specifically, because of my grief for Mark, the raw wound that hadn't begun to heal. I looked at the thing wearing my husband's face, really looked at it. In the growing light, the resemblance was still there, but less convincing, like a mask that didn't quite fit. "You're not Mark," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "Mark is gone. He died in a car accident 6 months ago. I scattered his ashes in Lake Michigan." Not Mark's expression flickered, confusion disrupting its confidence. "I am what remains of him. I am what you remember." "No," I said firmly. "You're nothing but a parasite feeding on my memories. Mark would never want me to join him in death. He'd want me to live." For the first time, uncertainty showed in those milky eyes. The other pale figures shifted restlessly, looking to their leader for guidance. I pressed my advantage. I loved my husband, I still do, but he's gone, and no monster wearing his face is going to convince me otherwise. I raised the knife, pointing it directly at Not Mark's chest. "You have no power over me." Not Mark hissed, the sound like steam escaping a pressure valve. His form seemed less solid now, edges blurring as if he might dissolve at any moment. "You cannot deny what you've seen," he snarled. "What you know exists beyond the veil of your comfortable world." "I'm not denying anything," I replied. "I've seen impossible things tonight, but that doesn't mean I have to surrender to them." The sun had crested the horizon now, its first rays filtering through the trees. The pale figures retreated from the light, their forms growing hazier. Their human servants remained, however, closing in with deliberate steps. I had seconds to make a decision. Fighting was futile. Running meant certain capture. That left only one option, a desperate gamble based on nothing but intuition and the fading look of uncertainty in Not Mark's eyes. I dropped the knife. "You want my grief?" I called to Not Mark, who had retreated to the shadows at the edge of the clearing. "You can't have it. It's mine. Every tear, every sleepless night, every memory of Mark, they belong to me. They're how I honor him, how I keep him alive in the only way that matters." The servants had reached me now, rough hands grabbing my arms, my shoulders. Luna snarled and bit at them, but there were too many. Someone struck her with something heavy, a rock or branch, and she yelped, staggering. "No!" I screamed, fighting against the hands that held me. Not Mark watched from the shadows, his form growing less distinct by the second. "Bring her to the pool," he ordered the servants, "while there's still time." They began dragging me toward the trees, toward the ravine and its tainted water. I struggled, but their grips were like iron, fingers digging painfully into my flesh. "Mark loved sunrises," I said loudly, forcing the words through fear-constricted lungs. "He used to wake me up to watch them when we went camping. He said they reminded him that no matter how dark the night, light always returns." Not Mark made a sound, half growl, half whimper. His features were melting now, losing definition, the resemblance to my husband fading with each word I spoke. "Our last trip together was to Pictured Rocks," I continued as they pulled me into the trees. "We watched the sunrise over Lake Superior. He told me it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, except for me." Luna had recovered enough to follow, snapping at the heels of the servants, who kicked at her but couldn't deter her. Her loyalty gave me strength, reminded me what I was fighting for. "I'm not going to die in this forest," I said, my voice rising. "I'm going to live for Mark, for myself, and no parasites that feed on grief are going to stop me." The servants had dragged me perhaps 20 yards into the forest when one of them suddenly released my arm, crying out in pain. Another followed suit, then another, clutching at their heads as if struck by sudden migraines. Notmark's form had deteriorated further, barely humanoid now. "Bring her," he shrieked, his voice distorted, bubbling. "The sun rises." But his control was slipping. The servants' vacant expressions had given way to confusion, pain, fear. They looked around as if waking from a dream, unable to comprehend where they were or what they were doing. I wrenched free of the remaining hands that held me and ran back toward the clearing, toward the sunlight. Luna raced beside me, bloody but unbowed. Behind us, the pale figures were retreating deeper into the forest, their forms dissolving like morning mist. Notmark made one final attempt, lunging from the shadows with outstretched hands that no longer resembled anything human. "Rebecca," he gurgled, my name twisted beyond recognition. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The sunlight embraced us as we burst into the clearing, its warmth chasing away the unnatural cold that had seeped into my bones. Behind me, I heard a sound like water rushing back to fill a vacuum, then silence. When I finally turned to look, the forest edge was empty. The pale figures had vanished, and the human servants stood blinking in confusion at the tree line, strangers to one another and to themselves. "Come on, Luna," I whispered, kneeling to examine her injuries. A gash on her flank had matted her fur with blood. "My name is Thomas Reeves, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The unseasonably warm autumn air clung to my skin as I shouldered my overstuffed backpack. Beside me, Mia adjusted her gear, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that emphasized her determined expression. We'd been planning this 4-day hiking trip through Illinois' Shawnee National Forest for months, a much-needed escape from our corporate lives in Chicago. "You remember the trail map, right?" Mia asked, her voice carrying a hint of the anxiety she'd been battling since her promotion 6 months ago. "Got it right here," I patted my pocket. "And I've downloaded offline maps on my phone. Garden of the Gods to One Horse Gap, then looping back through Jackson Hollow. I've got this." Our friend Jake emerged from his car, his familiar easy smile offering a brief moment of normalcy before our adventure. Jake had always been the outdoorsy one among us, the one who'd suggested this particular trail, insisting the views would heal our souls after our collective burnout at the marketing firm where we all worked. "Ready to disconnect, corporate drones?" he teased, slinging his pack on with practiced ease. Unlike Mia and me, Jake looked completely in his element, hiking boots well worn, clothing practical and weather appropriate. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, though something in the pit of my stomach had been unsettled since we'd passed the last small town. The forest ahead seemed too dark, too dense, despite the midday sun. "You guys know about the Bell Witch of Pope County, right?" Jake's eyes twinkled with mischief as we began our hike, leaving the parking area behind. "They say she roams these woods looking for travelers to torment?" Mia rolled her eyes. "Save the ghost stories for the campfire, Jake." I laughed, but the sound felt hollow in the hushed forest. The rational part of my brain dismissed his comment as typical Jake dramatics, but something about the way the trees seemed to close in around us made my skin prickle. The first few hours were exactly what we'd hoped for. The trail wound through ancient deciduous forests. Their leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red. Towering sandstone formations rose from the forest floor, evidence of the prehistoric sea that once covered this region. When we reached the Garden of the Gods observation trail, the panoramic views were breathtaking. Weathered rock formations jutting dramatically against the clear blue sky. "Worth the drive?" Jake asked, clearly proud of his recommendation. "Definitely," Mia agreed, her smile genuine for the first time in months. I snapped a photo of her there, sunlight highlighting the auburn tones in her hair, the spectacular backdrop making her look like she belonged on a tourism brochure. We made good progress that first day, setting up camp near Anvil Rock as the sun began its descent. Jake got the fire going while Mia and I pitched our tents. The easy camaraderie of old friends fell into place, and dinner around the campfire, freeze-dried meals that tasted better than they had any right to after a day of hiking, was accompanied by the beer we'd packed in despite the extra weight. To escaping the concrete jungle, Jake toasted, and we clinked our collapsible cups together. As darkness settled fully around us, Jake couldn't resist launching into the local legends. "So, you know why they call this area Little Egypt, right?" he began, his face eerily illuminated by the campfire. During a massive famine in the 1800s, northern Illinoisans had to travel south for grain, just like in the biblical story of Egypt. "That's just history, not exactly spooky," Mia pointed out. "I'm getting there," Jake insisted. "The thing is, this area has always had strange energy. The Shawnee believed certain places here were thin spots, where the veil between worlds barely exists." I shifted uncomfortably. The fire popped, sending sparks swirling into the night air. "There's a story about a family that disappeared near Jackson Hollow in the 1930s, Jake continued. Locals found their campsite intact, food still warm on the fire, belongings untouched. The only sign of disturbance was a strange symbol carved into a nearby tree." "What kind of symbol?" I asked, immediately wishing I hadn't. Jake's voice dropped lower. "A spiral with what looked like a stick figure in the center. After that, hikers reported seeing a family wandering the trails at dusk, parents and 2 children. But when approached, they would vanish into the mist." "Bullshit," Mia laughed. But I noticed she'd moved closer to the fire, as if seeking its protection. "Maybe," Jake shrugged. "But locals say if you hear whistling on the trail when nobody's there, the Bell Witch has marked you. They say she was once a normal woman who got lost in these woods, made a deal with something ancient that dwelled in the caves, and now she collects souls for it." On that note, I stood abruptly. I need to pee before bed. I walked a short distance from camp, just far enough for privacy but still within the reassuring glow of our fire. As I stood there in the darkness, I became acutely aware of the forest sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The woods had gone unnaturally silent. No insects chirping, no rustling of nocturnal creatures, just a heavy, waiting stillness. Then I heard it, a soft, melodic whistling, almost at the edge of audibility. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I quickly finished and hurried back to camp, telling myself it was just the wind through the rock formations or another camper in the distance. But deep down, I knew better. There was no wind tonight, and we hadn't seen another soul on the trails all day. I said nothing to the others. Jake would just use it to fuel more stories, and Mia was finally relaxing. Instead, I suggested we turn in, claiming exhaustion from the drive and hike. Inside my tent, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Every snap of a twig outside made me tense. I told myself it was just Jake's stories getting to me, but when I finally drifted to sleep, my dreams were filled with whistling and spiral symbols carved into ancient trees. I woke to gray dawn light and the sound of Mia's voice outside my tent. "Jake? Jake!" I scrambled out to find Mia standing between our tents, her face pale. "Jake's gone," she said, her voice tight with worry. "His tent's empty, but all his stuff is still here." My stomach dropped. Maybe he got up early, went to get water or something? But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong. Jake's sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, his boots still neatly placed at the tent entrance. His phone lay on top of his pack. "His headlamp is gone," Mia noted, "so he must have left in the dark." We called his name, our voices echoing off the sandstone cliffs, but only silence answered. "We need to look for him," Mia said firmly, already pulling on her hiking boots. We searched for hours, working in expanding circles from our campsite, calling Jake's name until our voices grew hoarse. The forest seemed to absorb our shouts, the thick canopy overhead casting everything in a greenish gloom despite the morning hour. "This doesn't make sense," Mia said when we returned to camp around noon, exhausted and increasingly frightened. Why would he wander off in the middle of the night without saying anything? I thought of the whistling I'd heard but said nothing. Instead, I checked our location on my phone's GPS. We're not far from the river-to-river trail. It connects to several roads. If we can't find him by evening, we can hike out tomorrow and get help. Mia nodded, her practical nature asserting itself. Let's leave a note and supplies in case he comes back, then keep searching the nearby trails. He couldn't have gone far. We spent the afternoon calling Jake's name and checking every side trail and overlook we could find. With each passing hour, my sense of dread intensified. The forest, which had seemed so beautiful yesterday, now felt oppressive and watchful. More than once I thought I heard distant whistling, but when I stopped to listen, there was only the sound of wind through leaves. As dusk approached, we reluctantly returned to camp. The decision to spend another night in the forest was difficult, but hiking out in the dark seemed more dangerous than waiting until morning. We sat close to the fire, neither of us having much appetite despite not eating since breakfast. The flames cast shifting shadows that seemed to move with unnatural purpose among the trees. "We'll find him tomorrow," Mia said with forced confidence. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The guilt was overwhelming. I should have told her about the whistling, should have taken Jake's stories more seriously. That night, I lay awake in my tent, jumping at every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps approaching the camp. Relieved, I quickly unzipped my tent, expecting to see Jake returning with some ridiculous explanation. But it wasn't Jake. A figure stood at the edge of our dying campfire. A human shape, but somehow wrong, the proportions slightly off. Then it stepped forward, and moonlight revealed Jake's face, but not Jake's eyes. His usually warm brown eyes were now milky white, and his familiar smile was stretched too wide across his face. "Thomas," he said, his voice carrying an echo that wasn't there before. "I found something amazing. You have to come see." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. This wasn't Jake, not really. "Don't be afraid," Not Jake continued, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "She just wants to meet you both. She's been so lonely since they trapped her in the hollow." "Jake," Mia's voice came from behind me. She'd emerged from her tent, relief quickly turning to confusion as she took in the scene. "What happened to you? Where have you been?" "Exploring," Not Jake said, that too-wide smile never faltering. "I've never seen so clearly before. Come with me. It's not far." My paralysis broke. I grabbed Mia's arm. "That's not Jake," I whispered urgently. Not Jake's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of such ancient malevolence that I felt my bladder threaten to release. "She said you might be difficult, Thomas. She heard you noticing her song last night. But it doesn't matter. You'll both come, one way or another." He lunged forward with inhuman speed. I shoved Mia behind me and raised my arm defensively. Pain exploded across my forearm as Not Jake's fingernails, now impossibly long and sharp, raked through my jacket and into flesh. Mia screamed. I stumbled backward, pulling her with me. Not Jake stood between us and our tents, between us and our supplies. "Run!" I yelled, shoving Mia toward the trail. We crashed through underbrush blind in the darkness, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Behind us, I heard Not Jake moving through the forest with terrible purpose, not rushed but inevitable. We ran until our lungs burned, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged. I realized with horror that in our panic, we'd veered away from the main trail. We were headed deeper into the forest, toward Jackson Hollow, the very place Jake had mentioned in his stories. "We need to find the main trail," I gasped, pulling Mia to a stop. "We're going the wrong way." She pulled out her phone with trembling hands. "No signal, and the GPS isn't working." I checked my own phone. The maps I'd downloaded showed only a blue dot in the middle of green, with no trails marked. That's impossible. I downloaded these maps yesterday. A whistling sound drifted through the trees, the same melody I'd heard the night before, but louder now, more insistent. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mia's face went slack with fear. "What is happening, Thomas? What was wrong with Jake?" I gripped her shoulders. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving, find our way back to the trail. Once it's light, we'll figure this out." We pushed on, trying to navigate by the stars, but clouds had moved in, obscuring the night sky. The forest grew denser, the terrain more difficult. Twice we thought we found a trail, only to have it peter out into nothingness after a few hundred yards. The whistling continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, as if circling us. Occasionally we heard what sounded like Jake calling our names, his voice distorted and wrong. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed against a fallen tree, exhausted beyond measure. "We need to rest," I said, checking my watch. It was just past 4 a.m. Dawn in a couple hours. Everything will look different in daylight. Mia nodded, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. We huddled together for warmth, neither of us speaking of what we'd seen back at camp. Rational explanations, that Jake was playing a cruel joke, that he'd had some kind of mental break, seemed increasingly implausible. Something was terribly wrong in Shawnee National Forest, and we were caught in the middle of it. I must have dozed despite my terror because I woke to Mia shaking me frantically. "Thomas, wake up!" I opened my eyes to early morning light and the sound of a child laughing. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a little girl in an old-fashioned dress, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Her hair was in perfect ringlets, her dress clean and pressed, completely out of place in the wilderness. "Hello," she said, her voice oddly formal. "Are you lost?" Before I could stop her, Mia was on her feet. "Yes, we are. Can you help us? Is there an adult with you?" The little girl smiled, a smile too knowing for a child. "My family is nearby. I can take you to them." "No," I said, standing up and grabbing Mia's arm. Something was very wrong. The girl's clothing looked like it was from another era, and her skin had an almost translucent quality in the dawn light. "Don't be rude," Mia hissed at me, then turned back to the girl. "We'd love to meet your family. Are they campers too?" The girl's expression shifted subtly, becoming more calculating. "In a way. We've been here a very long time." She held out her small hand. "Come with me." "Mia, don't," I pleaded. "Think about it. What's a child doing out here alone at dawn?" Doubt flickered across Mia's face. The girl's smile dropped, her eyes turning cold. "She said you'd be difficult, Thomas," the girl said in the exact same cadence not Jake had used hours before. "But you'll both come. Everyone does, eventually." The girl began to whistle, the same eerie melody I'd been hearing since our first night. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Mia away from the girl. As we fled, I glanced back. The girl stood watching us, but her form seemed to be shifting, growing taller, older, her dress darkening and becoming ragged. We crashed through the forest, heedless of direction, driven by pure terror. The whistling followed us, sometimes sounding like it came from ahead, sometimes from behind, disorienting and maddening. Eventually, we burst out onto what was unmistakably a marked trail. A wooden signpost indicated we were on the river-to-river trail, with Garden of the Gods 3.2 miles in one direction and One Horse Gap 2.8 miles in the other. "Which way?" Mia gasped, doubled over and trying to catch her breath. I thought quickly. One Horse Gap would lead us deeper into the forest, while Garden of the Gods would eventually connect to the parking area where we'd left our cars. Garden of the Gods, I decided, then back to the cars. We set off at a jog, unwilling to slow despite our exhaustion. The marked trail gave us hope. Other hikers might be around, and the clearly defined path meant we were heading toward civilization. The clouds had thickened, turning the morning gloomy and threatening rain. The forest around us had taken on a misty quality, reducing visibility and adding to our sense of isolation. "What happened to Jake?" Mia asked as we hurried along the trail. "That thing. It wasn't him, right?" "I don't know," I admitted. But you saw his eyes. Something was very wrong. I hesitated, then confessed. I heard whistling the first night, after Jake told those stories. I should have said something. Mia's face paled. You think the Bell Witch is real? That's insane, Thomas. 24 hours ago, I would have agreed with you, I said grimly. Now I'm not sure what to believe. A crack of thunder made us both jump. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour that soaked us to the skin. The trail became slick with mud, slowing our progress. There, Mia pointed ahead through the curtain of rain. Is that a shelter? Through the trees, I could make out what appeared to be a small wooden structure just off the trail. We hurried toward it, desperate for any respite from the storm. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't a trail shelter but an old, abandoned cabin. Its windows were empty of glass, the door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Under normal circumstances, I would never have considered entering such a decrepit structure, but the storm was worsening, and we were soaked and freezing. Just until the rain lets up, I told Mia, pushing the creaking door open. The cabin's interior was a single room, its roof miraculously still intact enough to keep out most of the rain. Dust covered the floor, undisturbed except for small animal tracks. An old iron stove stood in one corner, its pipe leading up through the ceiling. A wooden table, one leg shorter than the others, occupied the center of the room, and a crude bed frame with a rotted mattress sat against the far wall. Charming, Mia said, her attempt at humor falling flat. She rubbed her arms, trying to generate warmth. I examined the stove. This might still work. There's some old wood beside it. You're not seriously thinking of starting a fire in that thing? Mia asked incredulously. We're soaked and it's getting colder. Hypothermia is a real risk. I began arranging kindling in the stove. I'll check that the flue is clear. To my surprise, the stove was in better condition than the rest of the cabin. Soon, we had a small fire going, its heat a blessed relief against our wet clothes. We sat close to the stove, the sound of rain on the roof creating an almost cozy atmosphere that belied our terrifying situation. What are we going to do? Mia asked softly. About Jake, I mean. I had been asking myself the same question. We get to the cars, drive to the nearest town, and tell the authorities what happened. They can send a search party. And tell them what? That Jake was possessed by the Bell Witch? They'll think we're crazy. Or worse, that we did something to him. She was right. Of course, our story would sound insane to anyone who hadn't seen what we had. The fire popped and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. As I watched those shadows, I noticed something carved into the wooden planks beside the bed, a spiral with a crude stick figure in the center. My blood ran cold. It was exactly as Jake had described, the symbol found near the disappeared family's campsite. Mia, I said quietly, we need to leave. Now. She followed my gaze to the carving and scrambled to her feet. Jesus. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but thunder still rumbled in the distance. As we stepped back onto the trail, I noticed with growing unease that the path looked different. The trail markers, which had been clearly visible before, were now faded and weathered, as if decades had passed in the hour we'd spent in the cabin. Something's wrong, I muttered, looking up and down the trail. This doesn't look right. We're just disoriented, Mia said, though she didn't sound convinced. Let's keep going toward Garden of the Gods. We continued along the trail, moving as quickly as the slippery conditions would allow. The forest around us seemed older somehow, the trees larger and more gnarled than I remembered. The bird calls were different too, fewer of them, and strangely mournful. After about 20 minutes, we reached a fork in the trail that hadn't been on any of our maps. A weathered signpost offered no help, its writing long since faded to illegibility. This isn't possible, Mia whispered, fear edging her voice. We studied these trails for weeks. A familiar whistling drifted through the trees. She's playing with us, I realized, changing the paths, trying to lead us somewhere. That's not possible, Mia insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I forced myself to think clearly through my fear. The sun. We can navigate by the sun. I looked up, trying to locate it through the clouds, but the sky was a uniform gray, offering no directional clues. My compass, Mia suddenly remembered, digging through her pockets. She pulled out a small compass attached to her keychain. To our horror, the needle spun wildly, never settling on a direction. "This can't be happening," Mia said, her voice rising with panic. I gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me. We're going to pick a direction and stick with it. Eventually, we'll hit a road or a town." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear but determined. "Which way?" I examined both paths. One led uphill, potentially providing a better vantage point. Up, I decided. We might be able to spot something from higher ground. The climb was brutal on our exhausted bodies. The trail grew steeper and less defined the higher we went, until we were essentially scrambling up a rocky slope. The trees thinned, giving us hope that we might indeed find a viewpoint. When we finally reached the top, we found ourselves on a flat outcropping of sandstone that offered a panoramic view of the forest below, and what we saw drained the last bit of hope from my heart. Forest stretched in every direction, unbroken by roads or towns. The landscape was right. The distinctive rock formations of Shawnee National Forest were visible, but there were no signs of human habitation anywhere. No power lines, no distant buildings, not even logging roads. "That's not possible," Mia breathed. "There should be farms, roads, something." A movement in the trees below caught my eye. A figure was moving along the path we had just climbed. Jake, or the thing wearing Jake's form, he moved with unnatural speed, covering ground faster than any human should be able to. "He's coming," I said, grabbing Mia's hand. "We need to move." But where? The outcropping was a dead end, with sheer drops on 3 sides and our pursuer coming up the only path. "There." Mia pointed to a narrow ledge that seemed to lead around the side of the bluff. It might connect to another trail. It was a desperate gamble, but we had no choice. We edged onto the ledge, our backs pressed against the rock wall, shuffling sideways with painstaking slowness. The drop beside us was at least 60 feet, with jagged rocks at the bottom. We had made it about 30 feet when the whistling started again, this time from ahead of us. I looked up to see a woman standing further along the ledge where it curved around the bluff. She wore a tattered dress that might once have been white, her hair a wild tangle around a face that was both beautiful and terrible. Her eyes were completely black, without whites or pupils. "Elizabeth Bell," I whispered, the name coming to me from nowhere. The woman, the witch, smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. "You know my name," she said, her voice a rusty creak like a door that hadn't been opened in centuries. "That means you belong to me now." Behind us, Jake emerged onto the outcropping, cutting off our retreat. "Why are you doing this?" Mia cried, pressing closer to me on the narrow ledge. The witch cocked her head, bird-like. "Because you came to my forest. Because your friend told my story. Because I am hungry, and the Ancient One beneath is hungrier still." "What Ancient One?" I asked, trying to buy time, my mind racing for any way out of this trap. "The one that was here before the trees, before the rocks," the witch said. "The one that gave me power when I was lost, as your friend was lost. It feeds on fear and despair, and I am its faithful servant." As she spoke, I noticed something about the rock wall against my back. There was a narrow crevice, almost hidden by an overhanging ledge. It might be nothing, or it might be an opening. "Mia," I whispered, infinitesimally tilting my head toward the crevice. She gave the slightest nod, understanding immediately. "You're right," I told the witch, raising my voice. "We trespassed. We heard your story. But we don't have to be enemies. Jake told us you were once human, that you made a deal when you were lost. We're lost, too." The witch's expression flickered with something almost human. Surprise, perhaps. or a distant memory of connection. In that moment of distraction, I shoved Mia toward the crevice. "Go!" She squeezed into the opening without hesitation. I lunged after her, feeling the witch's fingernails scrape down my back as I twisted away from her grasp. Pain blazed across my skin, but adrenaline propelled me forward into the darkness. The crevice widened into a low tunnel that forced us to crouch. We stumbled forward blindly, guided only by the feel of the walls and the faint light filtering through from somewhere ahead. "Keep moving," I gasped, the pain from my lacerated back intensifying with each step. "Don't stop for anything." The sounds of pursuit echoed behind us, scraping, inhuman movements and that maddening whistling, now distorted by the tunnel acoustics into something even more terrifying. The tunnel began to slope downward, making our progress even more treacherous. We slipped and slid in the darkness, colliding painfully with the rocky walls. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, the passage opened into a larger cave with a shaft of daylight penetrating from a hole in the ceiling. "There's got to be a way out," Mia said, scanning the cave frantically. The cave was roughly circular with several dark openings leading off in different directions. Stalactites hung from the ceiling, and ancient-looking symbols were carved into the walls. Spirals and stick figures, hundreds of them, overlapping and interconnected. This is her place, I realized with growing horror. The center of her web. As if in confirmation, the whistling grew louder, coming now from multiple tunnel entrances. They were surrounding us. "Which way?" Mia asked, turning in a desperate circle. I spotted a tunnel slightly wider than the others, with natural light visible at its far end. "There!" We sprinted for the opening, but before we could reach it, the ground began to tremble. The vibrations grew stronger until the entire cave was shaking, rock dust raining down from the ceiling. From one of the dark tunnels came a sound like no other I'd ever heard. A massive exhalation, part groan, part roar, but with an unmistakable sense of awakening, of hunger. "The Ancient One," Mia whispered. The witch's laughter echoed through the cave. "Yes, it wakes for you." We ran for the lighted tunnel, terrified beyond rational thought. The passage sloped upward, making each step an agony for our exhausted legs. Behind us, the inhuman breathing grew louder, accompanied by a sound like massive stone limbs dragging across rock. The tunnel narrowed as we climbed until we were forced to turn sideways to continue. The light ahead grew brighter, giving us desperate hope. With one final push, we squeezed through a narrow opening and tumbled out into daylight. We found ourselves in a small box canyon, its walls too steep to climb. The only exit was the way we had come. "No," Mia sobbed, looking around frantically. "No, no, no." I turned back to the tunnel entrance, ready to defend Mia as best I could, though I knew it would be futile. But what emerged from the darkness wasn't the witch, or the possessed Jake, or even the ancient horror I had imagined. It was Jake. Normal Jake, his eyes the familiar warm brown, his expression confused and frightened. "Thomas? Mia? What's happening?" he asked, his voice his own again. "Where are we? The last thing I remember is being at camp then. Fragments. Nightmares." Mia rushed toward him. "Jake, are you really you?" I grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Wait, it could be a trick." Jake looked down at his hands in confusion. I think I hurt someone. I remember my hands, but they weren't my hands. They had claws." He looked up at me, horror dawning on his face. "Did I hurt you?" The genuine distress in his expression convinced me more than anything else could have. This was our Jake. "Not you," I said. "Something using you." A low rumble from the tunnel entrance made us all turn. The ground trembled beneath our feet. "We need to get out of here," Jake said urgently. "Now." "There's no way out," Mia replied, gesturing to the canyon walls. Jake looked around desperately, then pointed to a narrow ledge along one wall. "There, it might lead somewhere." Indeed, a barely perceptible path wound up from the ledge, zigzagging toward the top of the canyon. It was treacherous, no more than a foot wide in places, but it was our only hope. "Go," I told them. "I'll bring up the rear." We started up the path, clinging to the wall, trying not to look at the drop that grew more deadly with each step. The rumbling below intensified. Rocks began to fall from the canyon walls. "Faster!" Jake urged from the lead. We were about halfway up when the tunnel entrance below collapsed with a deafening roar. Dust billowed upward, momentarily obscuring our vision. When it cleared, we saw that the entire canyon floor was now filled with rubble. "Keep moving," I called, coughing in the dust. "It might not be over." We continued our precarious climb. As we neared the top, I heard it again. The faint sound of whistling carried on the wind. But it was fading, becoming more distant with each step we took. With one final effort, we pulled ourselves over the rim of the canyon and collapsed on solid ground, gasping for breath. When I could finally look around, I was astonished to find ourselves on a marked trail. A wooden sign nearby read, "Warning, unstable cliff edge, stay on marked path." "This is the river to river trail," Jake said in disbelief. "We're less than a mile from the parking lot." "That's impossible," Mia said. "We were lost for hours, miles from anywhere." But the trail was unmistakable, and through the trees ahead, I could see the familiar profile of Camel Rock, one of the landmark formations near the trailhead. We made our way back to the parking lot in silent disbelief. Our cars sat where we had left them, untouched. According to my watch, less than 24 hours had passed since we began our hike. "Our camping gear," Mia remembered. "It's still out there." "Leave it," Jake and I said simultaneously. As we prepared to drive away, a park ranger's vehicle pulled up beside us. The ranger, a weathered man in his 50s, rolled down his window. "Heading out early?" he asked pleasantly. "Most folks stay at least a couple nights." "Change of plans," I replied, trying to sound casual despite my torn clothing and the dried blood on my back. The ranger's eyes narrowed as he took in our disheveled state. "You folks run into some trouble out there?" I hesitated, unsure what to say. Jake stepped forward. "We got a bit lost, had to spend a rough night, but we found our way back," he said smoothly. The ranger nodded slowly. "Happens sometimes in these woods. People get turned around, especially around Jackson Hollow." At the mention of the place, I felt a chill despite the warm day. "Funny thing about these forests," the ranger continued, his gaze far off now. "The old-timers say there are places where the trails don't always lead to the same spot 2 days running. Places where time doesn't work quite right." He refocused on us. "But that's just superstition, of course." "Of course," I echoed hollowly. The ranger tipped his hat. "Travel safe now, and maybe stick to the marked trails next time you visit Shawnee." As he drove away, the three of us exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between us. We would never set foot in these woods again. During the long drive back to Chicago, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Jake remembered only fragments of his possession. A dark cave, a woman's voice promising him visions of incredible beauty, then nothing until he found himself in that canyon with us. Mia was quieter than I'd ever seen her, staring out the window as miles of farmland replaced the wild forest. "Do you think anyone would believe us?" she finally asked. "No," I replied honestly. "I barely believe it myself." "The symbol in the cabin," Jake said suddenly. "The spiral with the figure. I've been thinking about it. In some ancient cultures, spirals represented passages between worlds, thresholds where the rules are different." I shuddered, remembering the witch's words about thin places and veils between worlds. "I think we should never speak of this again," Mia said firmly. "To anyone. They'd think we were crazy. Or worse, they'd go looking for it." We agreed, making a pact of silence that would bind us together forever in ways our friendship never had before. That was 6 months ago. I've mostly recovered, though the scars on my back from the witch's claws still burn sometimes, especially at night. Jake seems normal again, though he doesn't hike anymore and flinches at the sound of whistling. Mia threw herself back into work with a vengeance, as if trying to bury the memories under spreadsheets and client meetings. We've kept our promise not to speak of what happened, but I know it haunts them as it haunts me. Sometimes at night, I dream of that cave with its ancient carvings, and I hear the breathing of something massive and patient beneath the forest floor. Sometimes I wonder if we truly escaped, or if Elizabeth Bell simply let us go for reasons of her own. And sometimes on the edge of sleep, I hear distant whistling, a melody that seems to call me back to Shawnee National Forest, to the hollow where something ancient waits, hungry and eternal, beneath the Illinois earth.